On the Ends of Good and Evil, De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, by Marcus Tullius Cicero, narrated by Robin Homer. Book 1. Exposition of Epicureanism. My dear Brutus, the following essay, I am well aware, attempting as it does to present in a Latin dress subjects that philosophers of consummate ability and profound learning have already handled in Greek, is sure to encounter criticism from different quarters. Certain persons, and those not without some pretension to letters, disapprove of the study of philosophy altogether. Others do not so greatly object to it, provided it be followed in dilettante fashion, but they do not think it ought to engage so large an amount of one's interest and attention. A third class, learned in Greek literature and contemptuous of Latin, will say that they prefer to spend their time in reading Greek. Lastly, I suspect there will be some who will wish to divert me to other fields of authorship, asserting that this kind of composition, though a graceful recreation, is beneath the dignity of my character and position. To all these objections, I suppose I ought to make some brief reply. The indiscriminate censure of philosophy has indeed been sufficiently answered already in the book which I wrote in praise of that study, in order to defend it against a bitter attack that had been made upon it by Hortensius. The favourable reception which that volume appeared to obtain from yourself and from others whom I considered competent to sit in judgment encouraged me to embark upon further undertakings, for I did not wish to be thought incapable of sustaining the interest that I had aroused. The second class of critics, who, however much they approve of philosophy, nevertheless would rather have it less eagerly prosecuted, are asking for a restraint that is not easy to practice. The study is one that, when once taken up, admits of no restriction or control. In fact, the attitude of the former class, who attempt to dissuade us from philosophy altogether, seems almost less unreasonable than that of those who would set limits to what is essentially unlimited, and expect us to stop halfway in a study that increases in value the further it proceeds. If wisdom be attainable, let us not only win, but enjoy it. Or if attainment be difficult, still there is no end to the search for truth other than its discovery. It is base to flag in the pursuit when the object pursued is so supremely lovely. Indeed, if we like writing, who would be so churlish as to debar us from it? Or, if we find it a labour, who is to set limits to another man's exertions? No doubt it is kind of Cremes in Terence's play to wish his neighbour not to dig or plough or any burden bear, for it is not industry in general, but toil of a menial kind from which he would deter him, but only a busybody would take exception to an occupation which, like mine, is a labour of love. A more difficult task, therefore, is to deal with the objection of those who profess a contempt for Latin writings as such. What astonishes me first of all about them is this: why should they dislike their native language for serious and important subjects, when they are quite willing to read Latin plays translated word for word from the Greek? Who has such a hatred, one might almost say for the very name of Roman, as to despise and reject the Medea of Aeneas, or the Antiope of Pacuvius, and give as his reason that, though he enjoys the corresponding plays of Euripides, he cannot endure books written in Latin? What, he cries, am I to read the young comrades of Caecilius, or Terence's Maid of Andros, when I might be reading the same two comedies of Menander? With this sort of person I disagree so strongly that, admitting the Electra of Sophocles to be a masterpiece, I yet think Attilius's poor translation of it worth my while to read. An iron writer, Licinius called him, still, in my opinion, a writer all the same, and therefore deserving to be read. For to be entirely unversed in our own poets argues either the extreme of mental inactivity, or else a refinement of taste carried to the point of caprice. To my mind, no one can be styled a well-read man who does not know our native literature. If we read, "Would that in forest glades," just as readily as the same passage in the Greek, shall we object to having Plato's discourses on morality and happiness set before the reader in Latin? And, supposing that, for our part, we do not fill the office of a mere translator, but while preserving the doctrines of our chosen authorities, add thereto our own criticism and our own arrangement, what ground have these objectors for ranking the writings of Greece above compositions that are at once brilliant in style and not mere translations from the Greek originals? Perhaps they will rejoin that the subject has already been dealt with by the Greeks already, but then what reason have they for reading the multitude of Greek authors either that one has to read? Take Stoicism. What aspect of it has Chrysippus left untouched? Yet we read Diogenes, Antipater, Nicarchus, Panatius, and many others, not least our friend Posidonius. Again, Theophrastus handles topics previously treated by Aristotle, yet he gives us no small pleasure all the same. Nor do the Epicureans cease from writing as the spirit moves them on the same questions on which Epicurus and the ancients wrote. If Greek writers find Greek readers when presenting the same subjects in a different setting, why should not Romans be read by Romans? Yet, even supposing I gave a direct translation of Plato or Aristotle, exactly as our poets have done with the plays, would it not, pray, be a patriotic service to introduce those transcendent intellects to the acquaintance of my fellow countrymen? As a matter of fact, however, this has not been my procedure hitherto, though I do not feel I am debarred from adopting it. Indeed, I expressly reserve the right of borrowing certain passages, if I think fit, and particularly from the philosophers just mentioned, when an appropriate occasion offers for so doing, just as Aeneas regularly borrows from Homer and Afranius from Menander. Nor yet shall I object, like our Lucilius, to all the world's reading what I write. I only wish his Perseus were alive today, and still more Scipio and Rutilius, in fear of whose criticism Lucilius protests that he writes for the public of Tarentum, Consentia, and Sicily. This no doubt is neat enough, like the rest of Lucilius, but there were not such learned critics in his day to tax his best efforts, and also his writings are in a lighter vein. They show consummate wit, but no great erudition. I, however, need not be afraid of any reader, if I am so bold as to dedicate my book to you, who rival even the Greeks as a philosopher. Still, you yourself challenge me to the venture by dedicating to me your delightful essay on virtue. But I have no doubt that the reason why some people take a dislike to Latin literature is that they have happened to meet with certain illiterate and uncouth productions which are bad Greek books in worse Latin versions. I have no quarrel with these persons, provided that they also refuse to read the Greek writers on the same subjects. But, given a noble theme and a refined, dignified, and graceful style, who would not read a Latin book? Unless it be someone ambitious to be styled a Greek out and out, as Albusius was greeted by Scaevola when the latter was prisoner at Athens. I am again referring to Lucilius, who relates the anecdote with much neatness and point. He puts the following excellent lines into the mouth of Scaevola. You vowed, Albusius, that to suit ye, 'twas as a Greek we must repute ye. Roman and Sabine being names, your man of ton and taste declaims. You scorned to own your native town, which bore such captains of renown as Pontius and Tritanius bold, who in the van Rome's ensigns hold. And so at Athens when I lay, and your respects you came to pay, my worship, humouring your freak, gave you good morrow straight in Greek. With Chire Titus, Chire Bol, guards, aides de camp, javelin men and all. Hence comes it that Albusius hates me, hence as his bitterest foe he rates me. Mucius's sarcasm was, however, deserved, but for my part I can never cease wondering what can be the origin of the exaggerated contempt for home products that is now fashionable. It would of course be out of place to attempt to prove it here, but in my opinion, as I have often argued, the Latin language, so far from having a poor vocabulary, as is commonly supposed, is actually richer than the Greek. When have we, that is to say, when have our competent orators or poets, at all events since they have had models to copy, ever lacked any of the resources either of the florid or the chaste style? In my own case, just as I trust I have done my duty at the post to which the Roman people appointed me, by my political activities and the toils and dangers I have undergone, so it is assuredly incumbent on me also to use my best endeavours, with such zeal, enthusiasm, and energy as I possess, to promote the advancement of learning among my fellow countrymen. Nor need I be greatly concerned to join issue with any who prefer to read Greek, provided that they actually do read it, and do not merely pretend to do so. It is my business to serve those who desire to enjoy literature in both languages, or who, if books in their own are available, do not feel any great need of Greek ones. Those again who would rather have me write on other subjects may fairly be indulgence to one who has written much already, in fact no one of our nation more, and who perhaps will write still more if his life be prolonged. And even were it not so, anyone who has been a careful student of my philosophical writings will pronounce that none of them are better worth reading than the present treatise. For what problem does life offer so important as all the topics of philosophy, and especially the questions raised in these volumes? What is the end, the final and ultimate aim? What gives the standard for all principles of well-being and of right conduct? What does nature pursue as the thing supremely desirable? What does she avoid as the ultimate evil? It is a subject on which the most learned philosophers disagree profoundly. Who then can think it derogatory, to such esteem as each may assign to me, to investigate what is the highest good and the truest rule in every relationship of life? Are we to have our leading statesmen debating such topics as whether the offspring of a female slave is to be considered as belonging to the party who has hired her, Publius Scaevola and Manius Manilius upholding one opinion, and Marcus Brutus the contrary? Not but what such discussions raise nice points of law, as well as being of practical importance for the business of life, and we read and shall continue to read with pleasure the treatises in question and others of the same nature. And shall these questions, which cover the entire range of conduct, be neglected? Legal subjects are no doubt more popular, but philosophy is unquestionably richer in interest. However, this is a point that may be left to the reader to decide. In the present work, we believe we have given a more or less exhaustive exposition of the whole subject of the ends of goods and evils. The book is intended to contain, so far as possible, a complete account, not only of the views that we ourselves accept, but also of the doctrines enunciated by all the different schools of philosophy. To begin with what is easiest, let us first pass in review the system of Epicurus, which to most men is the best known of any. Our exposition of it, as you shall see, will be as accurate as any usually given even by the professed adherents of his school. For our object is to discover the truth, not to refute someone as an opponent. An elaborate defence of the hedonistic theory of Epicurus was once delivered by Lucius Torquatus, a student well versed in all the systems of philosophy. To him I replied, and Gaius Triarius, a youth of remarkable learning and seriousness of character, assisted at the discussion. Both of these gentlemen had called to pay me their respects at my place in Cumae. We first exchanged a few remarks about literature, of which both were enthusiastic students. Then Torquatus said, "As we have for once found you at leisure, I am resolved to hear the reason why you regard my master Epicurus, not indeed with hatred, as those who do not share his views mostly do, but at all events with disapproval. I myself consider him as the one person who had discovered the truth, and who has delivered men from the gravest errors and imparted to them all there is to know about well-being and happiness. The fact is, I think you are like our friend Triarius, and dislike Epicurus because he has neglected the graces of style that you find in your Plato, Aristotle, and Theophrastus. For I can scarcely bring myself to believe that you think his opinions untrue." "Let me assure you, Torquatus," I said, "that you are entirely mistaken. With your master's style I have no fault to find. He expresses his meaning adequately, and gives me a plain, intelligible statement. Not that I despise eloquence in a philosopher, if he has it to offer, but I should not greatly insist on it if he has not. But his matter I do not find so satisfactory, and that in more points than one. However, many men, many friends, so it is possible that I am mistaken. "What is it, pray," he said, "to which you take exception? For I recognize you as a just critic, provided you really know what his doctrines are." "Oh," I said, "I know the whole of Epicurus's opinions well enough, unless you think that Phaedrus or Zeno did not tell me the truth. I have heard both of them lecture, though, to be sure, they convince me of nothing but their own devotion to the system. Indeed, I regularly attended those professors in company with our friend Atticus, who, for his part, had an admiration for them both, and a positive affection for Phaedrus. Every day we used to discuss together in private what we had heard at lecture, and there was never any dispute as to what I could understand. The question was what I could accept as true. "Well, then, what is the point?" said he. "I should very much like to know what it is you disagree with." "Let me begin," I replied, "with the subject of natural philosophy, which is Epicurus's particular boast. Here, in the first place, he is entirely second-hand. His doctrines are those of Democritus, with a very few modifications. And as for the latter, where he attempts to improve upon his original, in my opinion he only succeeds in making things worse. Democritus believes in certain things which he terms atoms, that is, bodies so solid as to be indivisible, moving about in a vacuum of infinite extent, which has neither top, bottom, nor middle, neither centre nor circumference. The motion of these atoms is such that they collide, and so cohere together, and from this process result the whole of the things that exist and that we see. Moreover, this movement of the atoms must not be conceived as starting from a beginning, but as having gone on for all eternity. Epicurus, for his part, where he follows Democritus, does not generally blunder. Still, there is a great deal in each of them with which I do not agree, and especially this. In the study of nature, there are two questions to be asked. First, what is the matter out of which each thing is made? Second, what is the force by which it is made? Now, Democritus and Epicurus have discussed the question of matter, but they have not considered the question of force, or the efficient cause. But this is a defect shared by both. I now come to the lapses peculiar to Epicurus. He believes that these same indivisible solid bodies are borne by their own weight perpendicularly downward, which he holds is the natural motion of all bodies. But, thereupon, this clever fellow, being met with the difficulty that, if they all travelled downwards in a straight line, and, as I said, perpendicularly, no one atom would ever be able to overtake any other atom, accordingly introduced an idea of his own invention. He said that the atom makes a very tiny swerve, the smallest divergence possible, and so are produced entanglements and combinations and cohesions of atoms with atoms, which result in the creation of the world and all its parts, and of all that in them is. Now, not only is the whole of this affair a piece of childish fancy, but it does not even achieve the result its author desires. The swerving is itself an arbitrary fiction, for Epicurus says the atoms swerve without a cause. Yet this is the capital offence in a natural philosopher, to speak of something taking place uncaused. Then, also, he gratuitously deprives the atoms of what he himself declared to be the natural motion of all heavy bodies, namely, a movement in a straight line downwards, and yet he does not attain the object for the sake of which his fiction was devised. For, if all the atoms swerve, none will ever come to cohere together, or if some swerve while others travel in a straight line, by their own natural tendency, in the first place, this will be tantamount to assigning to the atoms their different spheres of action, some to travel straight and some sideways, while secondly, and this is a weak point of Democritus also, this riotous hurly-burly of atoms could not possibly result in the ordered beauty of the world we know. It is also unworthy of a natural philosopher to deny the infinite divisibility of matter, an error that assuredly Epicurus would have avoided if he had been willing to let his friend Polyaenus teach him geometry, instead of making Polyaenus himself unlearn it. Democritus, being an educated man and well versed in geometry, thinks the sun is of vast size. Epicurus considers it perhaps a foot in diameter, for he pronounces it to be exactly as large as it appears, or a little larger or smaller. Thus, where Epicurus alters the doctrines of Democritus, he alters them for the worse, while for those ideas which he adopts, the credit belongs entirely to Democritus. The atoms, the void, the images, or as they call them, idola, whose impact is the cause not only of vision, but also of thought. The very conception of infinite space, aperia as they term it, is entirely derived from Democritus. And again, the countless numbers of worlds that come into existence and pass out of existence every day. For my own part, I reject these doctrines altogether, but still I could wish that Democritus, whom everyone else applauds, had not been vilified by Epicurus, who took him as his sole guide. Turn next to the second division of philosophy, the department of method and of dialectic, which is termed logique. Of the whole armour of logic, your founder, as it seems to me, is absolutely destitute. He does away with definition. He has no doctrine of division or partition. He gives no rules for deduction or syllogistic inference, and imparts no method for resolving dilemmas or for detecting fallacies of equivocation. The criteria of reality he places in sensation. Once let the senses accept something as true that is false, and every possible criterion of truth and falsehood seems to him to be immediately destroyed. He lays the very greatest stress upon that which, as he declares, nature herself decrees and sanctions, that is, the feelings of pleasure and pain. These, he maintains, lie at the root of every act of choice and of avoidance. This is the doctrine of Aristippus, and it is upheld more cogently and more frankly by the Cyrenaics. But, nevertheless, it is, in my judgment, a doctrine in the last degree unworthy of the dignity of man. Nature, in my own opinion at all events, has created and endowed us for higher ends. I may possibly be mistaken, but I am absolutely convinced that the Torquatus who first won that surname did not wrest the famous necklet from his foe in the hope of getting from it any physical enjoyment, nor did he fight the battle of the Viceris against the Latins in this third consulship for the sake of pleasure. Indeed, in sentencing his son to be beheaded, it would seem that he actually deprived himself of a great deal of pleasure, for he sacrificed his natural instincts of paternal affection to the claims of state and of his military office. Then think of the Titus Torquatus who was consul with Gnaeus Octavius, when he dealt so sternly with the son who had passed out of his paternal control through his adoption by Decius Solanus, when he summoned him into his presence to answer the charge preferred against him by a deputation from Macedonia of accepting bribes while prisoner in that province. When, after hearing both sides of the case, he gave judgment that he found his son guilty of having conducted himself in office in a manner unworthy of his ancestry, and banished him for ever from his sight. Think you he had any regard for his own pleasure? But I pass over the dangers, the toils, the actual pain that all good men endure for country and for friends, not only not seeking pleasure, but actually renouncing pleasures altogether, and preferring to undergo every sort of pain rather than be false to any portion of their duty. Let us turn to matters seemingly less important, but equally conclusive. What actual pleasure do you, Torquatus, or does Triarius here, derive from literature, from history and learning, from turning the pages of the poets and committing vast quantities of verse to memory? Do not tell me that these pursuits are in themselves a pleasure to you, and that so were the deeds I mentioned to the Torquati. That line of defence was never taken by Epicurus or Metrodorus, nor by any one of them if he possessed any intelligence or had mastered the doctrines of your school. Again, as to the question often asked, why so many men are Epicureans, though it is not the only reason, the thing that most attracts the crowd is the belief that Epicurus declares right conduct and moral worth to be intrinsically and of themselves delightful, which means productive of pleasure. These worthy people do not realize that, if this is true, it upsets the theory altogether. If it were admitted that goodness is spontaneously and intrinsically pleasant, even without any reference to bodily feeling, then virtue would be desirable for its own sake, and so also would knowledge, but this Epicurus by no means allows. These, then, said I, are the doctrines of Epicurus that I cannot accept. For the rest, I could desire that he himself had been better equipped with learning, since even you must recognize that he is deficient in that liberal culture which confers on its possessor the title of an educated man, or at all events that he had not deterred others from study, although I am aware that he has not succeeded in deterring you. I had spoken rather with the intention of drawing out Torquatus than of delivering a discourse of my own, but Triarius interposed with a smile. Why, you have practically expelled Epicurus altogether from the philosophic choir. What have you left to him except that, whatever his style may be, you find his meaning intelligible? His doctrines in natural philosophy were second-hand, and in your opinion unsound at that, and his attempts to improve on his authority only made things worse. Dialectic he had none. His identification of the chief good with pleasure, in the first place, was in itself an error, and secondly, this also was not original, for it had been said before, and said better, by Aristippus. To crown all, you added that Epicurus was a person of no education. Well, Triarius, I rejoined, when one disagrees with a man, it is essential to say what it is that one objects to in his views. What should prevent me from being an Epicurean if I accepted the doctrines of Epicurus, especially as the system is an exceedingly easy one to master? You must not find fault with members of opposing schools for criticizing each other's opinions, though I always feel that insult and abuse, or ill-tempered wrangling and bitter, obstinate controversy, are beneath the dignity of philosophy. I am quite of your mind, said Torquatus. It is impossible to debate without criticizing, but it is equally impossible to debate properly with ill temper or obstinacy. But I have something I should like to say in reply to all this, if it will not weary you. Do you suppose, said I, that I should have said what I have unless I wanted to hear you? Then would you like me to make a rapid review of the whole of Epicurus's system, or to discuss the single topic of pleasure, which is the one main subject of dispute? Oh, I said, that must be for you to decide. Very well then, said he, this is what I will do. I will expound on a single topic, and that the most important. Natural philosophy we will postpone, though I will undertake to prove to you both your swerve of the atoms and size of the sun, and also that very many errors of Democritus were criticized and corrected by Epicurus. But on the present occasion I will speak about pleasure. Not that I have anything original to contribute, yet I am confident that what I say will command even your acceptance. Be assured, I said, that I shall not be obstinate, but will gladly own myself convinced if you can prove your case to my satisfaction. I shall do so, he rejoined, provided you are as fair-minded as you promise, but I prefer to employ continuous discourse rather than question and answer. As you please, said I. So he began. I will start then, he said, in the manner approved by the author of the system himself, by settling what are the essence and qualities of the thing that is the object of our inquiry. Not that I suppose you to be ignorant of it, but because this is the logical method of procedure. We are inquiring, then, what is the final and ultimate good, which, as all philosophers are agreed, must be of such a nature as to be the ends to which all other things are means, while it is not itself a means to anything else. This Epicurus finds in pleasure. Pleasure he holds to be the chief good, pain the chief evil. This he sets out to prove as follows. Every animal, as soon as it is born, seeks for pleasure, and delights in it as the chief good, while it recoils from pain as the chief evil, and, so far as possible, avoids it. This it does as long as it remains unperverted at the prompting of nature's own unbiased and honest verdict. Hence Epicurus refuses to admit any necessity for argument or discussion to prove that pleasure is desirable and pain to be avoided. These facts, he thinks, are perceived by the senses, as that fire is hot, snow is white, honey sweet, none of which things need to be proved by elaborate argument. It is enough merely to draw attention to them. For there is a difference, he holds, between formal syllogistic proof of a thing and a mere notice or reminder. The former is the method for discovering abstruse and recondite truths, the latter for indicating facts that are obvious and evident. Strip mankind of sensation, and nothing remains. It follows that nature herself is the judge of that which is in accordance with or contrary to nature. What does nature perceive, or what does she judge of, beside pleasure and pain, to guide her actions of desire and of avoidance? Some members of our school, however, would refine upon this doctrine. These say that it is not enough for the judgment of good and evil to rest with the senses. The facts that pleasure is in and for itself desirable, and pain in and for itself to be avoided, can also be grasped by the intellect and the reason. Accordingly, they declare that the perception that the one is to be sought after and the other avoided is a notion naturally implanted in our minds. Others again, with whom I agree, observing that a great many philosophers do advance a vast array of reasons to prove why pleasure should not be counted as a good, nor pain as an evil, consider that we had better not be too confident of our case. In their view, it requires elaborate and reasoned argument, and abstruse theoretical discussion of the nature of pleasure and pain. But I must explain to you how all this mistaken idea of reprobating pleasure and extolling pain arose. To do so, I will give a complete account of the system, and expound the actual teachings of the great explorer of truth, the master builder of human happiness. No one rejects, dislikes, or avoids pleasure itself because it is pleasure, but because those who do not know how to pursue pleasure rationally encounter consequences that are extremely painful. Nor again is there anyone who loves or pursues or desires to obtain pain of itself because it is pain, but because occasionally circumstances occur in which toil and pain can produce him some great pleasure. To take a trivial example, which of us ever undertakes laborious physical exercise except to obtain some advantage from it? But who has any right to find fault with a man who chooses to enjoy a pleasure that has no annoying consequences, or one who avoids a pain that produces no resultant pleasure? On the other hand, we denounce with righteous indignation and dislike men who are so beguiled and demoralized by the charms of the pleasure of the moment, so blinded by desire, that they cannot foresee the pain and trouble that are bound to ensue. And equal blame belongs to those who fail in their duty through weakness of will, which is the same as saying, through shrinking from toil and pain. These cases are perfectly simple and easy to distinguish. In a free hour, when our power of choice is untrammeled, and when nothing prevents our being able to do what we like best, every pleasure is to be welcomed and every pain avoided. But in certain emergencies, and owing to the claims of duty or the obligations of business, it will frequently occur that pleasures have to be repudiated and annoyances accepted. The wise man, therefore, always holds in these matters to this principle of selection. He rejects pleasures to secure other greater pleasures, or else he endures pains to avoid worse pains. This being the theory I hold, why need I be afraid of not being able to reconcile it with the case of the Torquati, my ancestors? Your references to them just now were historically correct, and also showed your kind and friendly feeling towards myself. But all the same, I am not to be bribed by your flattery of my family, and you will not find me a less resolute opponent. Tell me, pray, what explanation do you put upon their actions? Do you really believe that they charged an armed enemy, or treated their children, their own flesh and blood, so cruelly, without a thought for their own interest or advantage? Why, even wild animals do not act in that way. They do not run amok so blindly that we cannot discern any purpose in their movements and their onslaughts. Can you then suppose that those heroic men performed their famous deeds without any motive at all? What their motive was, I will consider later on. For the present, I will confidently assert that if they had a motive for those undoubtedly glorious exploits, that motive was not a love of virtue in and for itself. He wrestled the necklet from his foe, yes, and saved himself from death. But he braved great danger, yes, before the eyes of an army. What did he get by it? Honour and esteem, the strongest guarantees of security in life. He sentenced his own son to death. If from no motive, I am sorry to be the descendant of anyone so savage and inhuman. But if his purpose was, by inflicting pain upon himself, to establish his authority as a commander, and to tighten the reins of discipline during a very serious war, by holding over his army the fear of punishment, then his action aimed at ensuring the safety of his fellow citizens, upon which he knew his own depended. And this is a principle of wide application. People of your school, and especially yourself, who are so diligent a student of history, have found a favourite field for the display of your eloquence in recalling the stories of brave and famous men of old, and in praising their actions not on utilitarian grounds, but on account of the splendour of abstract moral worth. But all of this folds to the ground if the principle of selection that I have just mentioned be established, the principle of foregoing pleasures for the purpose of getting greater pleasures, and enduring pains for the sake of escaping greater pains. But enough has been said at this stage about the glorious exploits and achievements of the heroes of renown. The tendency of all the virtues to produce pleasure is a topic that will be treated in its own place later on. At present, I shall proceed to expound the essence and qualities of pleasure itself, and shall endeavour to remove the misconceptions of ignorance, and to make you realize how serious, how temperate, how austere is the school that is supposed to be sensual, lax, and luxurious. The pleasure we pursue is not that kind alone which directly affects our physical being with a delightful feeling, a positively agreeable perception of the senses. On the contrary, the greatest pleasure, according to us, is that which is experienced as a result of the complete removal of pain. When we are released from pain, the mere sensation of complete emancipation and relief from uneasiness is in itself a source of gratification. But everything that causes gratification is a pleasure, just as everything that causes annoyance is a pain. Therefore, the complete removal of pain has correctly been termed a pleasure. For example, when hunger and thirst are banished by food and drink, the mere fact of getting rid of uneasiness brings a resultant pleasure in its train. So, generally, the removal of pain causes pleasure to take its place. Epicurus consequently maintained that there is no such thing as a neutral state of feeling intermediate between pleasure and pain, for the state supposed by some thinkers to be neutral, being characterized as it is by entire absence of pain, is itself, he held, a pleasure, and, what is more, a pleasure of the highest order. A man who is conscious of his condition at all must necessarily feel pleasure or pain. But complete absence of pain Epicurus considers to be the limit and highest point of pleasure. Beyond this point, pleasure may vary in kind, but it cannot vary in intensity or degree. Yet at Athens, so my father used to tell me when he wanted to air his wit at the expense of the Stoics, in the Ceramicus there is actually a statue of Chrysippus, seated and holding out one hand, the gesture being intended to indicate the delight which he used to take in the following little syllogism. Does your hand want anything while it is in its present condition? Answer, no, nothing. But if pleasure were a good, it would want pleasure. Yes, I suppose it would. Therefore, pleasure is not a good. An argument, as my father declared, which not even a statue would employ, if a statue could speak, because, though it is cogent enough as an objection to the Cyrenaics, it does not touch Epicurus. For if the only kind of pleasure were that which, so to speak, tickles the senses, an influence permeating them with a feeling of delight, neither the hand nor any other member could be satisfied with the absence of pain, unaccompanied by an agreeable and active sensation of pleasure. Whereas, if, as Epicurus holds, the highest pleasure be to feel no pain, Chrysippus's interlocutor, though justified in making his first admission that his hand in that condition wanted nothing, was not justified in his second admission that if pleasure were a good, his hand would have wanted it. And the reason why it would not have wanted pleasure is that to be without pain is to be in a state of pleasure. The truth of the position that pleasure is the ultimate good will most readily appear from the following illustration. Let us imagine a man living in the continuous enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures alike of body and of mind, undisturbed either by the presence or the prospect of pain. What possible state of existence could we describe as being more excellent or more desirable? One so situated must possess, in the first place, a strength of mind that is proof against all fear of death or of pain. He will know that death means complete unconsciousness, and that pain is generally light if long and short if strong, so that its intensity is compensated by brief duration and its continuance by diminishing severity. Let such a man, moreover, have no dread of any supernatural power. Let him never suffer the pleasures of the past to fade away, but constantly renew their enjoyment in recollection, and his lot will be one which will not admit of further improvement. Suppose, on the other hand, a person crushed beneath the heaviest load of mental and of bodily anguish, to which humanity is liable. Grant him no hope of ultimate relief in view, also give him no pleasure either present or in prospect. Can one describe or imagine a more pitiable state? If, then, a life full of pain is the thing most to be avoided, it follows that to live in pain is the highest evil, and this position implies that a life of pleasure is the ultimate good. In fact, the mind possesses nothing in itself upon which it can rest as final. Every fear, every sorrow can be traced back to pain. There is no other thing besides pain which is of its own nature capable of causing either anxiety or distress. Pleasure and pain, moreover, supply the motives of desire and of avoidance, and the springs of conduct generally. This being so, it clearly follows that actions are right and praiseworthy only as being a means to the attainment of a life of pleasure. But that which is not itself a means to anything else, but which all else is a means, is what the Greeks term the telos, the highest, ultimate, or final good. It must therefore be admitted that the chief good is to live agreeably. Those who place the chief good in virtue alone are beguiled by the glamour of a name, and do not understand the true demands of nature. If they will consent to listen to Epicurus, they will be delivered from the grossest error. Your school dilates on the transcendent beauty of the virtues, but were they not productive of pleasure, who would deem them either praiseworthy or desirable? We esteem the art of medicine not for its interest as a science, but for its conduciveness to health. The art of navigation is commended for its practical and not its scientific value, because it conveys the rules for sailing a ship with success. So also wisdom, which must be considered as the art of living, if it effected no result, would not be desired. But as it is desired, because it is the artificer that procures and produces pleasure. The meaning that I attach to pleasure must by this time be clear to you, and you must not be biased against my argument owing to the discreditable associations of the term. The great disturbing factor in man's life is ignorance of good and evil. Mistaken ideas about these frequently rob us of our greatest pleasures and torment us with the most cruel pain of mind. Hence we need the aid of wisdom to rid us of our fears and appetites, to root out all errors and prejudices, and to serve as our infallible guide to the attainment of pleasure. Wisdom alone can banish sorrow from our hearts and protect us from alarm and apprehension. Put yourself to school with her, and you may live in peace, and quench the glowing flames of desire. For the desires are incapable of satisfaction. They ruin not individuals, but whole families, nay, often shake the very foundations of the state. It is they that are the source of hatred, quarrelling, and strife, of sedition and of war. Nor do they only flaunt themselves abroad, or turn their blind onslaughts solely against others. Even when prisoned within the heart, they quarrel and fall out among themselves, and this cannot but render the whole of life embittered. Hence, only the wise man who prunes away all the rank growth of vanity and error can possibly live untroubled by sorrow and by fear, content with the bounds that nature has set. Nothing could be more useful or more conducive to well-being than Epicurus's doctrine as to the different classes of desires. One kind he classified as both natural and necessary, a second as natural without being necessary, and a third as neither natural nor necessary. The principle of classification being that the necessary desires are gratified with little trouble or expense, The natural desires also require but little, since nature's own riches, which suffice to content her, are both easily procured and limited in amount. But for the imaginary desires, no bound or limit can be discovered. If, then, we observe that ignorance and error reduce the whole of life to confusion, while wisdom alone is able to protect us from the onslaughts of appetite and the menaces of fear, teaching us to bear even the affronts of fortune with moderation, and showing us all the paths that lead to calmness and peace, why should we hesitate to avow that wisdom is to be desired for the sake of the pleasures it brings, and folly to be avoided because of its injurious consequences? The same principle will lead us to pronounce that temperance also is not desirable for its own sake, but because it bestows peace of mind, and soothes the heart with a tranquilizing sense of harmony. For it is temperance that warns us to be guided by reason in what we desire and avoid. Nor is it enough to judge what it is right to do or to leave undone, we also need to abide by our judgment. Most men, however, lack tenacity of purpose. Their resolution weakens and succumbs as soon as the fair form of pleasure meets their gaze, and they surrender themselves prisoners to their passions, failing to foresee the inevitable result. Thus, for the sake of a pleasure at once small in amount and unnecessary, and one which they might have procured by other means or even denied themselves altogether without pain, they incur serious disease or loss of fortune or disgrace, and not infrequently become liable to the penalties of the law and of the courts of justice. Those, on the other hand, who are resolved so to enjoy their pleasures as to avoid all painful consequences therefrom, and who retain their faculty of judgment and avoid being seduced by pleasure into courses that they perceive to be wrong, reap the very highest pleasure by foregoing pleasure. Similarly also, they often voluntarily endure pain to avoid incurring greater pain by not doing so. This clearly proves that intemperance is not undesirable for its own sake, while temperance is desirable not because it renounces pleasures, but because it procures greater pleasures. The same account will be found to hold good for courage. The performance of labours, the undergoing of pains, are not in themselves attractive, nor are endurance, industry, watchfulness, nor yet that much lauded virtue, perseverance, nor even courage. But we aim at these virtues in order to live without anxiety and fear, and, so far as possible, to be free from pain of mind and body. The fear of death plays havoc with the calm and even tenor of life, and to bow the head to pain and bear it abjectly and feebly is a pitiable thing. Such weakness has caused many men to betray their parents or their friends, some their country, and very many to utterly ruin themselves. So, on the other hand, a strong and lofty spirit is entirely free from anxiety and sorrow. It makes light of death, for the dead are only as they were before they were born. It is schooled to encounter pain by recollecting that pains of great severity are ended by death, and slight ones have frequent intervals of respite, while those of medium intensity lie within our own control. We can bear them if they are endurable, or if they are not, we may serenely quit life's theatre when the play has ceased to please us. These considerations prove that timidity and cowardice are not blamed, nor courage and endurance praised, on their own account. The former are rejected because they beget pain, the latter coveted because they beget pleasure. It remains to speak of justice to complete the list of the virtues, but this admits of practically the same treatment as the others. Wisdom, temperance, and courage have shown to be so closely linked with pleasure that they cannot possibly be severed or sundered from it. The same must be deemed to be the case with justice. Not only does justice never cause anyone harm, but, on the contrary, it always adds some benefit, partly owing to its essentially tranquilizing influence upon the mind, partly because of the hope that it warrants of a never-failing supply of the things that uncorrupted nature really needs. And just as rashness, license, cowardice ever torment the mind, ever awaken trouble and discord, so unrighteousness, when firmly rooted in the heart, causes restlessness by the mere fact of its presence, and if once it has found expression in some deed of wickedness, however secret the act, yet it can never feel assured that it will always remain undetected. The usual consequences of crime are, first, suspicion, next, gossip and rumour, then comes the accuser, then the judge. Many wrongdoers have even turned evidence against themselves, as happened in your consulship. And even if any think themselves well fenced and fortified against detection by their fellow men, they still dread the eye of heaven, and fancy that the pangs of anxiety night and day, gnawing at their hearts, are sent by Providence to punish them. But what can wickedness contribute towards lessening the annoyances of life, commensurate with its effects in increasing them, owing to the burden of a guilty conscience, the penalties of the law, and the hatred of one's fellows? Yet nevertheless some men indulge without limit their avarice, ambition, and love of power, lust, gluttony, and those other desires, which ill-gotten gains can never diminish, but rather must inflame the more, insomuch that they appear proper subjects for restraint rather than for reformation. Men of sound natures, therefore, are summoned by the voice of true reason to justice, equity, and honesty. For one without eloquence or resources, dishonesty is not a good policy, since it is difficult for such a man to succeed in his designs or to make good his success when once achieved. On the other hand, for the rich and clever, generous conduct seems more in keeping, and liberality wins them affection and goodwill, the surest means to a life of peace, especially as there really is no motive for transgressing, since the desires that spring from nature are easily gratified without doing any man wrong, while those that are imaginary ought to be resisted, for they set their affections upon nothing that is really wanted, while there is more loss inherent in injustice itself than there is profit in the gains it brings. Hence, justice also cannot correctly be said to be desirable in and for itself. It is so because it is so highly productive of gratification. For esteem and affection are gratifying, because they render life safer and fuller of pleasure. Hence we hold that unrighteousness is to be avoided, not simply on account of the disadvantages that result from being unrighteous, but even far more because, when it dwells in a man's heart, it never suffers him to breathe freely or know a moment's rest. If, then, even the glory of the virtues on which all the other philosophers love to expatiate so eloquently has, in the last resort, no meaning unless it be based on pleasure, whereas pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically attractive and alluring, it cannot be doubted that pleasure is the one supreme and final good, and that a life of happiness is nothing else than a life of pleasure. The doctrine thus firmly established has corollaries, which I will briefly expound. 1. The ends of goods and evils themselves, that is, pleasure and pain, are not open to mistake. Where people go wrong is in not knowing what things are productive of pleasure and pain. 2. Again, we aver that mental pleasures and pains arise out of bodily ones, and therefore I allow your contention that any Epicureans who think otherwise put themselves out of court, and I am aware that many do, though not those who can speak with authority. But, although men do experience mental pleasure that is agreeable and mental pain that is annoying, yet both of these, we assert, arise out of and are based upon bodily sensations. 3. Yet we maintain that this does not preclude mental pleasures and pains from being much more intense than those of the body, since the body can feel only what is present to it at the moment, whereas the mind is also cognizant of the past and of the future. For, granting that pain of the body is equally painful, yet our sensation of pain can be enormously increased by the belief that some evil of unlimited magnitude and duration threatens to befall us hereafter. And the same consideration may be transferred to pleasure. A pleasure is greater if not accompanied by any apprehension of evil. This therefore clearly appears, that intense mental pleasure or distress contributes more to our happiness or misery than a bodily pleasure or pain of equal duration. 4. But we do not agree that when pleasure is withdrawn, uneasiness at once ensues, unless the pleasure happens to have been replaced by a pain, while, on the other hand, one is glad to lose a pain even though no active sensation of pleasure comes in its place, a fact that serves to show how great a pleasure is the mere absence of pain. 5. But, just as we are elated by the anticipation of good things, so we are delighted by their recollection. Fools are tormented by the memory of former evils. Wise men have the delight of renewing in graceful remembrance the blessings of the past. We have the power both to obliterate our misfortunes in an almost perpetual forgetfulness and to summon up pleasant and agreeable memories of our successes. But when we fix our mental vision closely on the events of the past, then sorrow or gladness ensues according as these were evil or good. Here is indeed a royal road to happiness, open, simple, and direct. For clearly man can have no greater good than complete freedom from pain and sorrow, coupled with the enjoyment of the highest bodily and mental pleasures. Notice then how the theory embraces every possible enhancement of life, every aid to the attainment of that chief good which is our object. Epicurus, the man whom you denounce as a voluptuary, cries aloud that no one can live pleasantly without living wisely, honourably, and justly, and no one wisely, honourably, and justly without living pleasantly. For a city rent by faction cannot prosper, nor a house whose masters are at strife. Much less then can a mind, divided against itself and filled with inward discord, taste any particle of pure and liberal pleasure. But one who is perpetually swayed by conflicting and incompatible counsels and desires can know no peace or calm. Why, if the pleasantness of life is diminished by the more serious bodily diseases, how much more must it be diminished by the diseases of the mind? But extravagant and imaginary desires for riches, fame, power, and also for licentious pleasures are nothing but mental diseases. Then, too, there are grief, trouble, and sorrow, which gnaw the heart and consume it with anxiety, if men fail to realize that the mind need feel no pain unconnected with some pain of the body, present or to come. Yet there is no foolish man but is afflicted by some one of these diseases. Therefore there is no foolish man that is not unhappy. Moreover, there is death, the stone of Tantalus, ever hanging over men's heads, and superstition that poisons and destroys all peace of mind. Besides, they do not recollect their past, nor enjoy their present blessings. They merely look forward to those of the future, and as these are of necessity uncertain, they are consumed with agony and terror, and the climax of their torment is when they perceive too late that all their dreams of wealth or station, power or fame, have come to nothing. For they never attain any of the pleasures, the hope of which inspired them to undergo all their arduous toils. Or look again at others, petty, narrow-minded men, or confirmed pessimists, or spiteful, envious, ill-tempered creatures, unsociable, abusive, brutal. Others again enslaved to the follies of love, impudent or reckless, wanton, headstrong and yet irresolute, always changing their minds. Such failings render their lives one unbroken round of misery. The conclusion is that no foolish man can be happy, nor any wise man fail to be happy. This is a truth that we establish far more conclusively than do the Stoics, for they maintain that nothing is good save that vague phantom which they entitle moral worth, a title more splendid than substantial, and say that virtue resting on this moral worth has no need of pleasure, but is herself her own sufficient happiness. At the same time, this Stoic doctrine can be stated in a form which we do not object to, and indeed ourselves endorse. For Epicurus thus presents his wise man who is always happy. His desires are kept within bounds. Death he disregards. He has a true conception, untainted by fear, of the divine nature. He does not hesitate to depart from life, if that would better his condition. Thus equipped, he enjoys perpetual pleasure, for there is no moment when the pleasures he experiences do not outbalance the pains, since he remembers the past with gratitude, grasps the present with a full realization of its pleasantness, and does not rely upon the future. He looks forward to it, but finds his true enjoyment in the present. Also, he is entirely free from the vices that I instanced a few moments ago, and he derives no inconsiderable pleasure from comparing his own existence with the life of the foolish. Or any pains that the wise man may encounter are never so severe, but that he has more cause for gladness than for sorrow. Again, it is a fine saying of Epicurus that the wise man is but little interfered with by fortune. The great concerns of life, the things that matter, are controlled by his own wisdom and reason, and that no greater pleasure could be derived from a life of infinite duration than is actually afforded by this existence, which we know to be finite. Logic, on which your school lays such stress, he held to be of no effect, either as a guide to conduct or as an aid to thought. Natural philosophy he deemed all-important. This science explains to us the meaning of terms, the nature of predication, and the law of consistency and contradiction. Secondly, a thorough knowledge of the facts of nature relieves us of the burden of superstition, frees us from fear of death, and shields us against the disturbing effects of ignorance, which is often in itself a cause of terrifying apprehensions. Lastly, to learn what nature's real requirements are improves the moral character also. Besides, it is only by firmly grasping a well-established scientific system, observing the rule of canon that has fallen, as it were, from heaven, so that all men may know it, only by making that hope always to stand fast in our belief, unshaken by the eloquence of any man. On the other hand, without a full understanding of the world of nature, it is impossible to maintain the truth of our sense perceptions. Further, every mental presentation has its origin in sensation, so that no certain knowledge will be possible unless all sensations are true, as the theory of Epicurus teaches that they are. Those who deny the validity of sensation and say that nothing can be perceived, having excluded the evidence of the senses, are unable even to expound their own argument. Besides, by abolishing knowledge and science, they abolish all possibility of rational life and action. Thus, natural philosophy supplies courage to face the fear of death, resolution to resist the terrors of religion, peace of mind, for it removes all ignorance of the mysteries of nature, self-control, for it explains the nature of the desires and distinguishes their different kinds, and, as I showed just now, the canon, or criterion of knowledge, which Epicurus also established, gives a method of discerning truth from falsehood. There remains a topic that is preeminently germane to this discussion. I mean the subject of friendship. Your school maintains that if pleasure be the chief good, friendship will cease to exist. Now, Epicurus's pronouncement about friendship is that of all the means to happiness that wisdom has devised, none is greater, none more fruitful, none more delightful than this. Nor did he only commend this doctrine by his eloquence, but far more by the example of his life and conduct. How great a thing such friendship is shown by the mythical stories of antiquity. Review the legends from the remotest ages, and, copious and varied as they are, you will barely find in them 3 pairs of friends, beginning with Theseus and ending with Orestes. Yet Epicurus, in a single house, and a small one, maintained a whole company of friends, united by the closest sympathy and affection, and this still goes on in the Epicurean school. But to return to our subject, for there is no need of personal instances, I notice that the topic of friendship has been treated by Epicureans in 3 ways. First, some have denied that pleasures affecting our friends are in themselves to be desired by us in the same degree as we desire our own pleasures. This doctrine is thought by some critics to undermine the foundations of friendship. However, its supporters defend their position, and, in my opinion, have no difficulty in making good their ground. They argue that friendship can no more be sundered from pleasure than can the virtues, which we have discussed already. A solitary, friendless life must be beset by secret dangers and alarms. Hence, reason itself advises the acquisition of friends. Their position gives confidence and a firmly rooted hope of winning pleasure. And just as hatred, jealousy, and contempt are hindrances to pleasure, so friendship is the most trustworthy preserver and also creator of pleasure alike for our friends and for ourselves. It affords us enjoyment in the present, and it inspires us with hopes for the near and distant future. Thus, it is not possible to secure uninterrupted gratification in life without friendship, nor yet to preserve friendship itself unless we love our friends as much as ourselves. Hence, this unselfishness does not occur in friendship, while also friendship is closely linked with pleasure. For we rejoice in our friends' joy as much as in our own, and are equally pained by their sorrows. Therefore, the wise man will feel exactly the same towards his friend as he does towards himself, and will exert himself as much for his friend's pleasure as he would for his own. All that has been said about the essential connection of the virtues with pleasure must be repeated about friendship. Epicurus well said, I give almost his exact words, "The same creed that has given us courage to overcome all fear of everlasting or long-enduring evil hereafter has discerned that friendship is our strongest safeguard in this present term of life." Secondly, other Epicureans, though by no means lacking in insight, are a little less courageous in defying the opprobrious criticisms of the Academy. They fear that, if we hold friendship to be desirable only for the pleasure that it affords to ourselves, it will be thought that it is crippled altogether. They therefore say that the first advances and overtures, and the original inclination to form an attachment, are prompted by the desire for pleasure, but that, when the progress of the intercourse has led to intimacy, the relationship blossoms into an affection strong enough to make us love our friends for their own sake, even though no practical advantage accrues from their friendship. Does not familiarity endear us to localities, temples, cities, gymnasia, and playing grounds, horses and hounds, gladiatorial shows and fights with wild beasts? Then how much more natural and reasonable that this should be able to happen in our intercourse with our fellow men. The third view is that wise men have made a sort of compact to love their friends no less than themselves. We can understand the possibility of this, and we often see it happen. Clearly, no more effective means to happiness could be found than such an alliance. All these considerations go to prove not only that the theory of friendship is not embarrassed by the identification of the chief good with pleasure, but also that without this, no foundation for friendship whatsoever can be found. If, then, the doctrine I have set forth is clearer and more luminous than daylight itself, if it is derived entirely from nature's source, if my whole discourse relies throughout for confirmation on the unbiased and unimpeachable evidence of the senses, if lisping infants, nay, even dumb animals prompted by nature's teaching, almost find voice to proclaim that there is no welfare but pleasure, no hardship but pain, and their judgment in these matters is neither sophisticated nor biased, ought we not to feel the greatest gratitude to him who caught this utterance of nature's voice, and grasped its import so firmly and so fully that he has guided all sane-minded men into the paths of peace and happiness, calmness and repose? You are pleased to think him uneducated. The reason is that he refused to consider any education worth the name that did not help to school us in happiness. Was he to spend his time, as you encouraged Triarius and me to do, in perusing poets, who give us nothing solid and useful, but merely childish amusement? Was he to occupy himself like Plato, with music and geometry, arithmetic and astronomy, which, starting from false premises, cannot be true, and which, moreover, if they were true, would contribute nothing to make our lives pleasanter and therefore better? Was he, I say, to study arts like these, and neglect the master art, so difficult and correspondingly so fruitful, the art of living? No, Epicurus was not uneducated. The real Philistines are those who ask us to go on studying till old age the subjects that we ought to be ashamed not to have learnt in boyhood. Thus concluding, he added, I have explained my own view, but solely with the object of learning what your verdict is. I have never hitherto had a satisfactory opportunity of hearing it. End of Book 1. Book 2. Cicero's Arguments Against Epicureanism. Upon this they both looked at me, and signified their readiness to hear. So I began. First of all, I beg of you not to imagine that I am going to deliver you a formal lecture, like a professional philosopher. That is a procedure which, even in the case of philosophers, I have never very much approved. Socrates, who is entitled to be styled the father of philosophy, never did anything of the sort. It was the method of his contemporaries, the sophists as they were called. It was one of the sophists, Gorgias of Leontini, who first ventured in an assembly to invite a question, that is, to ask anyone to state what subject he desired to hear discussed. A bold undertaking indeed, I should call it a piece of effrontery, had not this custom later on passed over into our own school. But we read how Socrates made fun of the aforesaid Gorgias, and the rest of the sophists also, as we can learn from Plato. His own way was to question his interlocutors, and by a process of cross-examination to elicit their opinions, so that he might express his own views by way of rejoinder to their answers. This practice was abandoned by his successors, but was afterwards revived by Arcesilas, who made it a rule that those who wished to hear him should not ask him questions, but should state their own opinions, and when they had done so, he argued against them. But, whereas the pupils of Arcesilas did their best to defend their own position, with the rest of the philosophers, the student who has a question is then silent, and indeed this is nowadays the custom even in the academy. The would-be learner says, for example, "The chief good in my own opinion is pleasure," and the contrary is then maintained in a formal discourse, so that it is not hard to realize that those who say they are of a certain opinion do not actually hold the view they profess, but want to hear what can be argued against it. We are adopting a more profitable mode of procedure, for Torquatus has not only told us his own opinion, but also his reasons for holding it. Still, for my part, though I enjoyed his long discourse very much, I believe all the same that it is better to stop at point after point, and make out what each person is willing to admit and what he denies, and then to draw such inferences as one desires from these admissions, and so arrive at one's conclusion. When the exposition goes rushing on like a mountain stream in spate, it carries along with it a vast amount of miscellaneous material, but there is nothing one can take hold of or rescue from the flood. There is no point at which one can stem the torrent of oratory. However, in philosophical investigation, a methodical and systematic discourse must always begin by formulating a preamble, like that which occurs in certain forms of process at law. The issue shall be as follows, so that the parties to the debate may be agreed as to what the subject is about which they are debating. This rule was laid down by Plato in Phaedrus, and it was approved by Epicurus, who realized that it ought to be followed in every discussion. But he failed to see what this involved. For he says that he does not hold with giving a definition of the thing in question, yet without this it is sometimes impossible for the disputants to agree what the subject under discussion is, as, for example, in the case of the very question we are now debating. We are trying to discover the end of goods, but how can we possibly know what the nature of this is without comparing notes as to what we mean in the phrase end of goods by the term end and also by the term good itself? Now this process of disclosing latent meanings, of revealing what a particular thing is the process of definition, and you yourself now and then unconsciously employed it. For you repeatedly defined this very notion of end, or final or ultimate aim, as that to which all right actions are a means, while it is not itself a means to anything else. Excellent so far. Very likely, had occasion arisen, you would have defined the good itself either as the naturally desirable, or the beneficial, or the delightful, or just that which we like. Well then, if you don't mind, as you do not entirely disapprove of definition, and indeed practice it when it suits your purpose, I should be glad if you would now define pleasure, the thing which is the subject of the whole of our present inquiry. "Dear me," cried Torquatus, "who is there who does not know what pleasure is? Who needs a definition to assist him to understand it?" "I should say that I myself was such a person," I replied, "did I not believe that, as a matter of fact, I do fully understand the nature of pleasure, and possess a well-founded conception and comprehension of it. As it is, I venture to assert that Epicurus himself does not know what pleasure is, but is uncertain about it. He is always harping on the necessity of carefully sifting out the meaning underlying the terms we employ, and yet he occasionally fails to understand what is the import of the term pleasure. I mean, what is the notion that corresponds to the term? Torquatus laughed. "Come, that is a good joke," he said, "that the author of the doctrine that pleasure is the end of things desirable, the final and ultimate good, should actually not know what manner of thing pleasure itself is." "Well," I replied, "either Epicurus does not know what pleasure is, or the rest of mankind all over the world do not." "How so?" he asked. "Because the universal opinion is that pleasure is a sensation actively stimulating the percipient sense, and diffusing over it a certain agreeable feeling." "What then?" he replied. "Does not Epicurus recognize pleasure in your sense?" "Not always," said I. "Now and then, I admit, he recognizes it only too fully, for he solemnly avows that he cannot even understand what good there can be, or where it can be found, apart from that which is derived from food and drink, the delight of the ears, and the grosser forms of gratification. Do I misrepresent his words?" "Just as if I were ashamed of all that," he cried, "or unable to explain the sense in which it is spoken." "Oh," said I haven't the least doubt you can explain it with ease, and you have no reason to be ashamed of sharing the opinions of a wise man, who stands alone, so far as I am aware, in venturing to arrogate to himself that title. For I do not suppose that Metrodorus himself claimed to be a wise man, though he did not care to refuse the compliment when the name was bestowed upon him by Epicurus, while the famous seven of old received their appellation not by their own votes, but by the universal suffrage of mankind. Still, for the present, I take it for granted that in the utterance in question, Epicurus undoubtedly recognizes the same meaning of pleasure as everyone else. Everyone uses the Greek word hedone and the Latin voluptas to mean an agreeable and exhilarating stimulation of the sense. "Well then," he asked, "what more do you want?" "I will tell you," I said, "though more for the sake of ascertaining the truth than for any desire to criticize yourself or Epicurus." "I also," he replied, "would much rather learn anything you may have to contribute than criticize your views." "Do you remember, then," I said, "what Hieronymus of Rhodes pronounced to be the chief good, the standard, as he conceives it, to which all other things should be referred?" "I remember," said he, "that he considers the end to be freedom from pain." "Well," said I, "what is the same philosopher's view about pleasure?" "He thinks that pleasure is not desirable in itself." "Then, in his opinion, to feel pleasure is a different thing from not feeling pain." "Yes," he said, "and there he is seriously mistaken, since, as I have just shown, the complete removal of pain is the limit of the increase of pleasure." "Oh," I said, "as for the formula, freedom from pain, I will consider its meaning later on. But unless you are extraordinarily obstinate, you are bound to admit that freedom from pain does not mean the same as pleasure." "Well, but on this point you will find me obstinate," said he, "for it is as true as any position can be." "Pray," said I, "when a man is thirsty, is there any pleasure in the act of drinking?" "That is undeniable," he answered. "Is it the same pleasure as the pleasure of having quenched one's thirst?" "No, it is a different kind of pleasure. For the pleasure of having quenched one's thirst is a static pleasure, but the pleasure of actively quenching it is a kinetic pleasure." "Why then," I asked, "do you call two such different things by the same name?" "Do you not remember," he replied, "what I said just now, that when all pain has been removed, pleasure may vary in kind, but cannot be increased in degree?" "Oh yes, I remember," said I, "but, though your language was quite correct in form, your meaning was far from clear." Variation is a good Latin term. We use it strictly of different colours, but it is applied metaphorically to a number of things that differ. We speak of a varied poem, a varied speech, a varied character, varied fortunes. Pleasure, too, can be termed varied when it is derived from a number of unlike things, producing unlike feelings of pleasure. If this were the variation you spoke of, I could understand the term, just as I understand it without your speaking of it. But I cannot quite grasp what you mean by variation, when you say that when we are free from pain we experience the highest pleasure, and that, when we are enjoying things that excite a pleasant activity of the senses, we then experience an active or kinetic pleasure that causes a variation of our pleasant sensations, but no increase in the former pleasure that consists in absence of pain. Although why you should call this pleasure, I cannot make out. Well, he asked, can anything be more pleasant than freedom from pain? Still, I replied, granting there is nothing better, that point I waive for the moment, surely it does not therefore follow that what I may call the negation of pain is the same thing as pleasure. Absolutely the same, said he. Indeed, the negation of pain is a very intense pleasure, the most intense pleasure possible. If then, said I, according to your accounts the chief good consists entirely in feeling no pain, why do you not keep to this without wavering? Why do you not firmly maintain this conception of the good and no other? What need is there to introduce so abandoned a character as Mistress Pleasure into the company of those honourable ladies, the virtues? Her very name is suspect, and lies under a cloud of disrepute, so much so that you Epicureans are fond of telling us that we do not understand what Epicurus means by pleasure. I am a reasonably good-tempered disputant, but for my own part, when I hear this assertion, and I have encountered it fairly often, I am sometimes inclined to be a little irritated. Do I not understand the meaning of the Greek word hedone, the Latin word voluptas? Pray, which of these two languages is it that I am not acquainted with? Moreover, how comes it that I do not know what the word means, while all and sundry who have elected to be Epicureans do? As for that, your sect argues very plausibly that there is no need for the aspirant to philosophy to be a scholar at all, and you are as good as your word. Our ancestors brought old Cincinnatus from the plough to be dictator. You ransack the country villages for your assemblage of, doubtless respectable, but certainly not very learned adherents. Well, if these gentlemen can understand what Epicurus means, cannot I? I will prove to you that I do. In the first place, I mean the same by pleasure as he does by hedone. One often has some trouble to discover a Latin word that shall be the precise equivalent of a Greek one, but in this case no search was necessary. No instance can be found of a Latin word that more exactly conveys the same meaning as the corresponding Greek word than does the word voluptas. Every person in the world who knows Latin attaches to this word two ideas, that of gladness of mind and that of a delightful excitation of agreeable feeling in the body. On the one hand, there is the character in Trabea, who speaks of excessive pleasure of the mind, meaning gladness, the same feeling as is intended by the person in Caecilius, who describes himself as being glad with every sort of gladness. But there is this difference, that the word pleasure can denote a mental as well as a bodily feeling. The former a vicious emotion in the opinion of the Stoics, who define it as elation of the mind under an irrational conviction that it is enjoying some great good, whereas joy and gladness are not used of bodily sensation. However, pleasure, according to the usage of all who speak good Latin, consists in the enjoyment of a delightful stimulation of one of the senses. The term delight also you may apply if you like to the mind. To delight is said of both mind and body, and from it the adjective delightful is derived, so long as you understand that between the man who says, "So full am I of gladness that I am all confusion," and him who says, "Now, my soul with anger burns," one of whom is transported with gladness and the other tormented with painful emotion, there is the intermediate state, though our acquaintanceship is but quite recent, where the speaker feels neither gladness nor sorrow. and that, similarly, between the enjoyment of the most desirable bodily pleasures and the endurance of the most excruciating pains, there is the neutral state, devoid of either. Well, do you think I have properly grasped the meaning of the terms, or do I still require lessons in the use of either Greek or Latin? And, even supposing that I do not understand what Epicurus says, still I believe I really have a very clear knowledge of Greek, so that perhaps it is partly his fault for using such unintelligible language. Obscurity is excusable on two grounds. It may be deliberately adopted, as in the case of Heraclitus, the surname of the obscure who bore so dark his philosophic lore. Or the obscurity may be due to the abstruseness of the subject, and not of the style. An instance of this is Plato's Timaeus. But Epicurus, in my opinion, has no intention of not speaking plainly and clearly if he can, nor is he discussing a recondite subject like natural philosophy, nor a technical subject such as mathematics, but a lucid and easy topic, and one that is generally familiar already. And yet you Epicureans do not deny that we understand what pleasure is, but what he means by it, which proves not that we do not understand the real meaning of the word, but that Epicurus is speaking an idiom of his own, and ignoring our accepted terminology. For if he means the same as Hieronymus, who holds that the chief good is a life entirely devoid of trouble, why does he insist on using the term pleasure, and not rather freedom from pain, as does Hieronymus, who understands his own meaning? Whereas, if his view is that the end must include kinetic pleasure, for so he describes this vivid sort of pleasure, calling it kinetic, in contrary to the pleasure of freedom from pain, which is static pleasure, what is he really aiming at? For he cannot possibly convince any person who knows himself, anyone who has studied his own nature and sensations, that freedom from pain is the same thing as pleasure. This, Torquatus, is to do violence to the senses, this uprooting from our minds our knowledge of the meaning of words ingrained. Who is not aware that the world of experience contains these three states of feeling? First, the enjoyment of pleasure, second, the sensation of pain, and third, which is my own condition and doubtless also yours at the present moment, the absence of both pleasure and pain. Pleasure is the feeling of a man eating a good dinner, pain that of one being broken on the rack. But do you really not see the intermediate between those two extremes lies a vast multitude of persons who are feeling neither gratification nor pain? I certainly do not, said he. I maintain that all who are without pain are enjoying pleasure, and what is more, the highest form of pleasure. Then you think that a man who, not being thirsty himself, mixes a drink for another, feels the same pleasure as the thirsty man who drinks it. At this, Torquatus exclaimed, A truce to question and answer, if you do not mind. I told you from the beginning that I preferred continuous speeches. I foresaw this kind of thing exactly. I knew we should come to logic chopping and quibbling. Then, said I, would you sooner we adopted the rhetorical and not the dialectical mode of debate? Why, he cried, just as if continuous discourse were proper for orators only, and not for philosophers as well. That is the view of Zeno the Stoic, I rejoined. He used to say that the faculty of speech in general falls into two departments, as Aristotle had already laid down, and that rhetoric was like the palm of the hand, dialectic like the closed fist, because rhetoricians employ an expansive style, and dialecticians one that is more compressed. So I will defer to your wish, and will speak, if I can, in the rhetorical manner, but with the rhetoric of the philosophers, not with the sort which we use in the law courts. The latter, as it employed a popular style, must necessarily sometimes be a little lacking in subtlety. Epicurus, however, Torquatus, in his contempt for dialectic, which comprises at once the entire science of discerning the essence of things, of judging their qualities, and of conducting a systematic and logical argument, Epicurus, I say, makes havoc of his exposition. He entirely fails, in my opinion at all events, to impart scientific precision to the doctrines he desires to convey. Take, for example, the particular tenet that we have just been discussing. The chief good is pleasure, say you Epicureans. Well then, you must explain what pleasure is. Otherwise, it is impossible to make clear the subject under discussion. Had Epicurus cleared up the meaning of pleasure, he would not have fallen into such confusion. Either he would have upheld pleasure in the same sense as Aristippus, that is, an agreeable and delightful excitation of the sense, which is what even dumb cattle, if they could speak, would call pleasure, or, if he preferred to use an idiom of his own, instead of speaking the language of the Darnaeans one and all, men of Mycenae, Scions of Athens, and the rest of the Greeks invoked in these anapaests, he might have confined the name of pleasure to this state of freedom from pain, and despised pleasure as Aristippus understands it. Or else, if he approved of both sorts of pleasure, as in fact he does, then he ought to combine together pleasure and absence of pain, and profess two ultimate goods. Many distinguished philosophers have, as a matter of fact, thus interpreted the ultimate good as composite. For instance, Aristotle combined the exercise of virtue with well-being lasting throughout a complete lifetime. Calipho united pleasure with moral worth. Diodorus, to moral worth, added freedom from pain. Epicurus would have followed their example, had he coupled the view we are now discussing, which, as it is, belongs to Hieronymus, with the old doctrine of Aristippus. For there is a real difference of opinion between them, and accordingly each sets up his own separate end. And as both speak unimpeachable Greek, Aristippus, who calls pleasure the chief good, does not count absence of pain as pleasure, while Hieronymus, who makes the chief good absence of pain, never employs the name pleasure to denote this negation of pain, and in fact does not reckon pleasure among things desirable at all. For you must not suppose it is merely a verbal distinction. The things themselves are different. To be without pain is one thing, to feel pleasure another. Yet you Epicureans try to combine these quite dissimilar feelings, not merely under a single name, for that I could more easily tolerate, but as actually being a single thing, instead of really two, which is absolutely impossible. Epicurus, approving both sorts of pleasure, ought to have recognized both sorts, as he really does in fact, though he does not distinguish them in words. In a number of passages where he is commending that real pleasure which all of us call by the same name, he goes so far as to say that he cannot even imagine any good that is not connected with pleasure of the kind intended by Aristippus. This is the language that he holds at discourse dealing solely with the topic of the chief good. Then there is another treatise containing his most important doctrines in a compendious form, in which we are told he uttered the very oracles of wisdom. Here he writes the following words, with which you, Torquatus, are of course familiar, for every good Epicurean has got by heart the master's curiae doxae, or authoritative doctrines, since these brief aphorisms or maxims are held to be of sovereign efficacy for happiness. So I will ask you to kindly notice whether I translate this maxim correctly. If the things in which sensualists find pleasure could deliver them from the fear of the gods and of death and of pain, and could teach them to set bounds to their desires, we should have no reason to blame them, since on every hand they would be abundantly supplied with pleasures, and on no side would be exposed to any pain or grief, which are the sole evil. At this point Triarius could contain himself no longer. "Seriously now, Torquatus," he broke out, "does Epicurus really say that?" For my own part, I believe that he knew it to be true, but wanted to hear Torquatus admit it. Torquatus, nothing daunted, answered with complete assurance. "Certainly, those are his very words, but you don't perceive his meaning." "Oh," I retorted, "if he means one thing and says another, I never shall understand his meaning. But what he understands he expresses clearly enough. If what he here says is that sensualists are not to be blamed provided they are wise men, he is talking nonsense. He might as well say that parricides are not to be blamed provided they are free from avarice, and free from fear of the gods, of death and pain. Even so, what is the point of granting the sensual any saving clause? Why imagine certain fictitious persons who, though living sensually, would not be blamed by the wisest of philosophers for their sensuality, provided they avoided other faults? All the same, Epicurus, would not you blame sensualists, for the very reason that their one object in life is the pursuit of pleasure of any and every sort, especially as, according to you, the highest pleasure is to feel no pain? Yet we shall find profligates, in the first place, so devoid of religious scruples that they will eat the food of the pattern, and secondly, so fearless of death as to be always quoting the lines from the hymnus, "Enough for me 6 months of life, the 7th to hell I pledge." Or, if they want an antidote to pain, out comes from their phial the great Epicurean panacea, short if it's strong, light if it's long. Only one point I can't make out. How can a man at once be a sensualist and keep his desires within bounds? What then is the point of saying, I should have no fault to find with them if they kept their desires within bounds? That is tantamount to saying, I should not blame the profligate if they were not profligate. He might as well say he would not blame the dishonest either if they were upright men. Here is our rigid moralist maintaining that sensuality is not in itself blameworthy, and I profess, Torquatus, on the hypothesis that pleasure is the chief good, he is perfectly justified in thinking so. I should be sorry to picture to myself, as you are so fond of doing, debauchees who are sick at table, have to be carried home from dinner parties, and next day gorge themselves again before they have recovered from the effects of the night before, men who, as the saying goes, have never seen either sunset or sunrise, men who run through their inheritance and sink into penury. None of us supposes that profligates of that description live pleasantly. No, but men of taste and refinement, with first-rate chefs and confectioners, fish, birds, game, and the like of the choicest, careful of their digestion, with wine in flask, decanted from a new-broached cask, as Lucilius has it, wine of tang bereft, all harshness in the strainer left, with the accompaniment of dramatic performances and their usual sequel, the pleasures apart from which Epicurus, as he loudly proclaims, does not what good is. Give them also beautiful boys to wait upon them, with drapery, silver, Corinthian bronzes, and the scene of the feast, the banqueting room, all in keeping. Take profligates of this sort, that these live well or enjoy happiness, I will never allow. The conclusion is, not that pleasure is not pleasure, but that pleasure is not the chief good. The famous Laelius, who had been a pupil of Diogenes the Stoic in his youth, and later of Panatius, was not called the wise because he was no judge of good eating, for a wise mind is not necessarily incompatible with a nice palate, but because he set little store by it. Dinner of herbs, how all the earth derides thee and ignores thy worth, though Laelius, our Roman sage, shouted thy praises to the age, our gourmands one by one arraigning. Bravo, Laelius, sage indeed. How true the lines, O bottomless gulf of gluttony, Publius Galonius, cried he, you're a poor devil, truth to tell, who never in your life dined well, no, never once, although you pay a fortune for a fish away, lobster or sturgeon brobdingnagian. The speaker is a man who, setting no value on pleasure, declares that he who makes pleasure his all in all cannot dine well. Observe, he does not say Galonius never dined pleasantly, which would be untrue, but never well. So strict and severe is the distinction he draws between pleasure and good. The conclusion is that, though all who dine well dine pleasantly, yet he who dines pleasantly does not necessarily dine well. Laelius always dined well. What does well mean? Lucilius shall say, well cooked, well seasoned. Ah, but now the principal dish, with a deal of honest talk. And the result, a pleasant meal. For he came to dinner that, with mind at ease, he might satisfy the wants of nature. Laelius is right, therefore, in denying that Gelonius ever dined well, right in calling him unhappy, and that too, although all his thoughts were centred on the pleasures of the table. No one will deny that he dined pleasantly. Then why not well? Because well implies rightly, respectably, worthily, whereas Gelonius dined wrongly, disreputably, basely. Therefore he did not dine well. It was not that Laelius thought his dinner of herbs more palatable than Gelonius's sturgeon, but that he disregarded the pleasures of the palate altogether, and this he could not have done had he made the chief good consist in pleasure. Consequently, you are bound to discard pleasure, not merely if you are to guide your conduct aright, but even if you are to be able consistently to use the language of respectable people. Can we possibly, therefore, call a thing the chief good with regard to living, when we feel we cannot call it so, even in regard to dining? But how says our philosopher? The desires are of three kinds, natural and necessary, natural but not necessary, neither natural nor necessary. To begin with, this is a clumsy division. It makes three classes where there are really only two. This is not dividing, but hacking in pieces. Thinkers trained in the science which Epicurus despised usually put it thus: the desires are of two kinds, natural and imaginary. Natural desires again fall into two subdivisions, necessary and not necessary. That would have rounded it off properly. It is a fault in division to reckon a species a genus. Still, do not let us stickle about form. Epicurus despises the niceties of dialectic. His style neglects distinctions. We must humour him in this, provided that his meaning is correct. But for my own part, I cannot cordially approve, tolerate, a philosopher who talks of setting bounds to the desires. Is it possible for desire to be kept within bounds? It ought to be destroyed, uprooted altogether. On your principle, there is no form of desire whose possessor could not be morally approved. He will be a miser, within limits, an adulterer, in moderation, and a sensualist to correspond. What sort of philosophy is this, that instead of dealing wickedness its death-blow, is satisfied with moderating our vices? Albeit I quite approve the substance of this classification, it is the form of it to which I take exception. Let him speak of the first class as the needs of nature, and keep the term desire for another occasion, to be put on trial for its life when he comes to deal with avarice, intemperance, and all the major vices. This classification of the desires is, then, a subject on which Epicurus is fond of enlarging. Not that I find fault with him for that. We expect so great and famous a philosopher to maintain his dogmas boldly. But he often seems unduly eager to approve of pleasure in the common acceptance of the term, for this occasionally lands him in a very awkward position. It conveys the impression that there is no action so base but that he would be ready to commit it for the sake of pleasure, provided he were guaranteed against detection. Afterwards, put to the blush by this conclusion, for the force of natural instinct, after all, is overwhelming, he turns for refuge to the assertion that nothing can enhance the pleasure of freedom from pain. Oh, but, we urge, your static condition of feeling no pain is not what is termed pleasure at all. I don't trouble about the name, he replies. Well, but the thing itself is absolutely different. Oh, I can find hundreds and thousands of people less precise and troublesome than yourselves, who will be glad to accept as true anything I like to teach them. Then why do we not go a step further and argue that, if not to feel pain is the highest pleasure, therefore not to feel pleasure is the greatest pain? Why does not this hold good? Because the opposite of pain is not pleasure, but absence of pain. But fancy his failing to see how strong a proof it is that the sort of pleasure without which he declares he has no idea at all what good means, and he defines it in detail as pleasure of the palate, of the ears, and subjoins the other kinds of pleasure, which cannot be specified without an apology, He fails, I say, to see that this, the sole good which our strict and serious philosopher recognizes, is actually not even desirable, inasmuch as, on his own showing, we feel no need of this sort of pleasure, so long as we are free from pain. How inconsistent this is! If only Epicurus had studied definition and division, if he understood the meaning of predication or even the customary use of terms, he would never have fallen into such a quandary. As it is, you see what he does. He calls a thing pleasure that no one ever called by that name before. He confounds two things that are distinct. The kinetic sort of pleasure, for so he terms the delightful and, so to speak, sweet-flavoured pleasures we are considering, at one moment he so disparages that you would think you are listening to Manius Curius, while at another moment he so extols it that he tells us he is incapable even of imagining what other good there can be. Now that is language that does not call for a philosopher to answer it. It ought to be put down by the police. His morality is at fault, and not only his logic. He does not censure profligacy, provided it be free from unbridled desire and from fear of consequences. Here he seems to be making a bid for converts. The would-be roue need only turn philosopher. For the origin of the chief good, he goes back, I understand, to the birth of living things. As soon as an animal is born, it delights in pleasure, and seeks it as a good, but shuns pain as an evil. Creatures, as yet uncorrupted, are, according to him, the best judges of good and evil. That is the position both as you expounded it, and as it is expressed in the phraseology of your school. What a mass of fallacies! Which kind of pleasure will it be that guides a mewling infant to distinguish between the chief good and evil? Static pleasure or kinetic? Since we learn our language, heaven help us, from Epicurus. If the static kind, the natural instinct is clearly towards self-preservation, as we agree. But if the kinetic, and this is after all what you maintain, then no pleasure will be too base to be accepted. And also our newborn animal in this case does not find its earliest motive in the highest form of pleasure, since this, on your showing, consists in absence of pain. For proof of this, however, Epicurus cannot have gone to children, nor yet to animals, which, according to him, hold a mirror up to nature. He could hardly say that natural instinct guides the young to desire the pleasure of freedom from pain. This cannot excite appetition. The static condition of feeling no pain exerts no driving power, supplies no impulse to the will, so that Hieronymus also is wrong here. It is the positive sensation of pleasure and delight that furnishes a motive. Accordingly, Epicurus's standing argument to prove that pleasure is naturally desired is that infants and animals are attracted by the kinetic sort of pleasure, not the static kind, which consists merely in freedom from pain. Surely, then, it is inconsistent to say that natural instinct starts from one sort of pleasure, but that the chief good is found in another. As for the lower animals, I set no value on their verdict. Their instincts may be wrong, although we cannot say they are perverted. One stick has been bent and twisted on purpose, another has grown crooked. Similarly, the nature of wild animals, though not indeed corrupted by bad education, is corrupt of its own nature. Again, in the infant, the natural instinct is not to seek pleasure. Its instinct is merely towards self-regard, self-preservation, and protection from injury. Every living creature, from the moment of birth, loves itself and all its members. Primarily, this self-regard embraces the two main divisions of mind and body, and subsequently the parts of each of these. Both mind and body have certain excellences. Of these, the young animal grows vaguely conscious, and later begins to discriminate, and to seek for the primary endowments of nature, and shun their opposites. Whether the list of these primary natural objects of desire includes pleasure or not is a much debated question. But to hold that it includes nothing else but pleasure, neither the limbs, nor the senses, nor mental activity, nor bodily integrity, nor health, seems to me to be the height of stupidity. And this is the fountainhead from which one's whole theory of goods and evils must necessarily flow. Polemo, and also before him Aristotle, held that the primary objects were the ones I have just mentioned. Thus arose the doctrine of the Old Academy and of the Peripatetics, maintaining that the end of goods is to live in accordance with nature, that is, to enjoy the primary gifts of nature's bestowal with the accompaniment of virtue. Callipho coupled with virtue pleasure alone. Diodorus, freedom from pain. In the case of all the philosophers mentioned, their end of goods logically follows. With Aristippus, it is pleasure pure and simple. With the Stoics, harmony with nature, which they interpret as meaning virtuous or morally good life, and further explain this as meaning to live with an understanding of the natural course of events, selecting things that are in accordance with nature and rejecting the opposite. Thus, there are three ends that do not include moral worth. One that of Aristippus or Epicurus, the second that of Hieronymus, and the third that of Carneades. Three that comprise moral goodness together with some additional element, those of Polemo, Callipho, and Diodorus, and one theory that is simple, of which Zeno was the author, and which is based entirely on propriety, that is, on moral worth. As for Pyrrho, Aristo, and Erillus, they have long ago been exploded. All of these but Epicurus were consistent, and made their final ends agree with their first principles. Aristippus holding the end to be pleasure, Hieronymus freedom from pain, Carneades the enjoyment of the primary natural objects. Whereas Epicurus, if in saying that pleasure was the primary object of attraction, he meant pleasure in the sense of Aristippus, ought to have maintained the same ultimate good as Aristippus. Or if he made pleasure in the sense of Hieronymus's chief good, should he at the same time have allowed himself to make the former kind of pleasure, that of Aristippus, the primary attraction? The fact is that when he says that the verdict of the senses themselves decides pleasure to be good and pain evil, he assigns more authority to the senses than the law allows to us when we sit as judges in private suits. We cannot decide any issue not within our jurisdiction, and there is not really any point in the proviso which judges are fond of adding to their verdicts, if it be a matter within my jurisdiction, for if it is not within their jurisdiction, the verdict is equally invalid with the proviso omitted. What does come under the verdict of the senses? Sweetness, sourness, smoothness, roughness, proximity, distance, whether an object is stationary or moving, square or round. A just decision can therefore only be delivered by reason, with the aid in the first place of that knowledge of things human and divine, which may rightly claim the title of wisdom, and secondly, with the assistance of the virtues, which reason would have to be the mistresses of all things, but you considered as the handmaids and subordinates of the pleasures. After calling all these into counsel, she will pronounce first as to pleasure that she has no claim not merely to be enthroned alone in the seat of our ideal chief good, but even to be admitted as the associate of moral worth. As regards freedom from pain, her decision will be the same, for Carneades will be put out of court, and no theory of the chief good will be approved that either includes pleasure or absence of pain, or does not include moral worth. Two views will thus be left. After prolonged consideration of these, either her final verdict will be that there is no good but moral worth, and no evil but moral baseness, all other things being entirely unimportant, or of so little importance that they are not desirable or to be avoided, but only to be selected or rejected, or else she will prefer the theory which she will recognize as including the full beauty of moral worth, enriched by the addition of the primary natural objects, and of a life completed to its perfect span. And her judgment will be all the clearer if she can first of all settle whether the dispute between these rival theories is one of fact, or turns on verbal differences only. Guided by the authority of reason, I will now adopt a similar procedure myself. As far as possible, I will narrow the issue, and will assume that all the simple theories of those who include no admixture of virtue are to be eliminated from philosophy altogether. First among these comes the system of Aristippus, and the Cyrenaic school in general. who did not shrink from finding their chief good in pleasure of the sort that excites the highest amount of actively agreeable sensation, and who despised your freedom from pain. They failed to see that, just as the horse is designed by nature for running, the ox for ploughing, and the dog for hunting, so man, as Aristotle observes, is born for two purposes: thought and action. He is, as it were, a mortal god. The Cyrenaics held, on the contrary, that this godlike animal came into being, like some dull, half-witted sheep, in order to feed and to enjoy the pleasure of procreation, a view that seems to me the climax of absurdity. So much in answer to Aristippus, who considers pleasure in the only sense in which we all of us employ the term, to be not merely the highest, but the sole pleasure that exists. Your school holds a different view. However, as I said, Aristippus is wrong. Neither man's bodily conformation, nor his surpassing mental faculty of reason, indicates that he was born for the sole purpose of enjoying pleasure. Nor yet can we listen to Hieronymus, whose chief good is the same as is occasionally, or rather only too frequently, upheld by yourselves: freedom from pain. If pain is an evil, to be without this evil is not enough to constitute the good life. Let Ennius say, if he likes, that enough and more of good is his who hath no ill. But let us reckon happiness not by the avoidance of evil, but by the attainment of good. Let us seek it not in the idle acceptance, whether of positive delights like Aristippus, or of freedom from pain like Hieronymus, but in a life of action or of contemplation. The same arguments can be urged against the chief good of Carneades, which he advanced less from a desire to adopt it himself than to use it as a weapon in his battle with the Stoics. Though it is such that, if added to virtue, it may be thought to be of importance, and to be likely to augment the sum total of happiness, which is the one subject of our inquiry. Whereas those who join with virtue either pleasure, the one thing she values least, or freedom from pain, which, even though it is devoid of evil, yet is not the chief good, make a not very acceptable combination. Nor yet can I understand why they go to work in so cautious and miserly a fashion. You would think they had to purchase the commodity which is to be added to virtue. To begin with, they choose the cheapest things they can find to add, and then each dole out one only, instead of coupling with moral worth all the things initially approved by nature. Aristo and Pyrrho thought all these things utterly worthless, and said, for example, that there was absolutely nothing to choose between the most perfect health and the most grievous sickness, and consequently men have long ago quite rightly given up arguing against them. For in insisting upon the unique importance of virtue in such a sense as to rob it of any power of choice among external things, and to deny it any starting point or basis, they destroyed the very virtue they desired to cherish. Again, Erillus, in basing everything on knowledge, fixed his eyes on one definite good, but this not the greatest good, nor one that could serve as the guide of life. Accordingly, Erillus himself has long ago been set aside. Since Chrysippus, no one has even troubled to refute him. Accordingly, your school remains, for there is no coming to grips with the academics, who affirm nothing positively, and, despairing of a knowledge of certain truth, make up their minds to take apparent probability as their guide. Epicurus, however, is a more troublesome opponent, because he is a combination of two different sorts of pleasure, and because, besides himself and his friends, there have been so many later champions of his theory, which, somehow or other, enlist the support of that least competent but most powerful adherent, the general public. Unless we refute these adversaries, all virtue, all honour, all true merit must be abandoned. Thus, when all the other systems have been discarded, there remains a duel in which the combatants are, not myself and Torquatus, but virtue and pleasure. This contest is by no means scouted by so penetrating and so industrious a writer as Chrysippus, who considers that the rivalry between pleasure and virtue is the cardinal issue in the whole question of the chief good. My own view is that, if I can succeed in proving the existence of moral worth as a thing essentially and for itself desirable, your entire system at once collapses. Accordingly, I will begin by defining, with such brevity as the occasion demands, the nature of moral worth. And then, Torquatus, I will proceed to deal with each of your points, unless my memory should happen to fail me. By moral worth, then, we understand that which is of such a nature that, though devoid of all utility, it can justly be commended in and for itself, apart from any profit or reward. A formal definition such as I have given may do something to indicate its nature, but this is more clearly explained by the general verdict of mankind at large, and by the aims and actions of all persons of high character. Good men do a great many things from which they anticipate no advantage, solely for the motive of propriety, morality, and right. For among the many points of difference between man and the lower animals, the greatest difference is that nature has bestowed on man the gift of reason, of an active, vigorous intelligence, able to carry on several operations at the same time with extreme speed, and having, so to speak, a keen sense to discern the causes and effects of things, to draw analogies, combine things separate, connect the future with the present, and survey the entire field of the subsequent course of life. It is reason, moreover, that has inspired man with a relish for his kind. She has produced a natural conformity both of language and of habit. She has prompted the individual, starting from friendship and from family affection, to expand his interests, forming social ties with his fellow citizens, and later with all mankind. She reminds him that, as Plato puts it in his letter to Archytas, man was not born for self alone, but for country and for kindred, claims that leave but a small part of him for himself. Nature has also engendered in mankind the desire of contemplating truth. This is most clearly manifested in our hours of leisure. When our minds are at ease, we are eager to acquire knowledge, even of the movements of the heavenly bodies. This primary instinct leads us on to love all truth as such, that is, all that is trustworthy, simple, and consistent, and to hate things insincere, false, and deceptive, such as cheating, perjury, malice, and injustice. Further, reason possesses an intrinsic element of dignity and grandeur, suited rather to require obedience than to render it, esteeming all the accidents of human fortune not merely as endurable, but also as unimportant, a quality of loftiness and elevation, fearing nothing, submitting to no one, ever unsubdued. These three kinds of moral goodness being noted, there follows a fourth kind, possessed of equal beauty, and indeed arising out of the other three. This is the principle of order and restraint. From recognizing something analogous to this principle in the beauty and dignity of outward forms, we pass to beauty in the moral sphere of speech and conduct. Each of the three excellences mentioned before contributes something to this fourth one. It dreads rashness, it shrinks from injuring anyone by wanton word or deed, and it fears to do or say anything that may appear unmanly. There, Torquatus, is a full, detailed, and complete scheme of moral worth, the whole of which these four virtues, which you also mentioned, constitute the parts. Yet your Epicurus tells us that he is utterly at a loss to know what nature or qualities are assigned to this morality by those who make it the measure of the chief good. For if morality be the standard to which all things are referred, while yet they will not allow that pleasure forms any part of it, he declares that they are uttering sounds devoid of sense, those are his actual words, and that he has no notion or perception whatever of any meaning that this term morality can have attached to it. In common parlance, moral, honourable, means merely that which ranks high in popular esteem, and popular esteem, says Epicurus, though often in itself more agreeable than certain forms of pleasure, yet is desired simply as a means to pleasure. Do you realize how vast a difference of opinion this is? Here is a famous philosopher whose influence has spread not only over Greece and Italy, but throughout all barbarian lands as well, protesting that he cannot understand what moral worth is if it does not consist in pleasure, unless indeed it be that which wins the approval and applause of the multitude. For my part, I hold that what is popular is often positively base, and that, if ever it is not base, this is only when the multitude happens to applaud something that is right and praiseworthy in and for itself, which even so is not called moral or honourable because it is widely applauded, but because it is of such a nature that, even if men were unaware of its existence or never spoke of it, it would still be worthy of praise for its own beauty and loveliness. Hence Epicurus is compelled by the irresistible force of instinct to say in another passage what you also said just now, that it is impossible to live pleasantly without also living morally. What does he mean by morally now? The same as pleasantly? If so, does it amount to saying that it is impossible to live morally unless you live morally, or unless you make public opinion your standard? He means then that he cannot live pleasantly without the approval of public opinion. But what can be baser than to make the conduct of the wise man depend upon the gossip of the foolish? What therefore does he understand by moral in this passage? Clearly, nothing but that which can be rightly praised for its own sake. For if it be praised as being a means to pleasure, what is there creditable about this? You can get pleasure at the provision dealer's. No, Epicurus, who esteems moral worth so highly as to say that it is impossible to live pleasantly without it, is not the man to identify moral or honourable with popular, and maintain that it is impossible to live pleasantly without popular esteem. He cannot understand moral to mean anything else than that which is right, that which is in and for itself, independently, intrinsically, and of its own nature, praiseworthy. This, Torquatus, accounts for the glow of pride with which, as I noticed, you informed us how loudly Epicurus proclaims the impossibility of living pleasantly without living morally, wisely, and justly. Your words derived potency from the grandeur of the things that they denoted. You drew yourself up to your full height, and kept stopping and fixing us with your gaze, as if solemnly asseverating that Epicurus does occasionally commend morality and justice. Were those names never mentioned by philosophers, we should have no use for philosophy. How well they sounded on your lips! Too seldom does Epicurus speak to us of wisdom, courage, justice, temperance. Yet it is the love that those great names inspire which has lured the ablest of mankind to devote themselves to philosophical studies. The sense of sight, says Plato, is the keenest sense we possess, yet our eyes cannot behold wisdom. Could we see her, what passionate love would she awaken? And why is this so? Is it because of her supreme ability and cunning in the art of contriving pleasures? Why is justice commended? What gave rise to the old familiar saying, "A man with whom you might play odd and even in the dark"? This proverb strictly applies to the particular case of honesty, but it has this general application, that in all our conduct we should be influenced by the character of the action, not by the presence or absence of a witness. How weak and ineffectual are the deterrents you put forward, the torture of a guilty conscience, and the fear of the punishment that offenders incur, or at all events stand in continual dread of incurring in the end. We must not picture our unprincipled man as a poor-spirited coward, tormenting himself about his past deeds and afraid of everything, but as shrewdly calculating profit in all he does, sharp, dexterous, a practised hand, fertile in devices for cheating, without witness or accomplice. Don't suppose I am speaking of Lucius Tubulus, who, when he sat as praetor to try charges of murder, made so little concealment of taking bribes for his verdict, that next year the tribune of the plebs, Publius Scaevola, moved in the plebeian assembly for a special inquiry. The bill passed the plebs, and the Senate commissioned the consul Gnaeus Capio to hold the investigation, but Tubulus promptly left the country, and did not venture to stand his trial, so open was his guilt. It is not, therefore, a question of a rascal merely, but of a crafty rascal, like Quintus Pompeius when he disowns the treaty he had made with the Numantines, nor yet of a timid, cowardly knave, but of one who, to begin with, is deaf to the voice of conscience, which it is assuredly no difficult matter to stifle. The man we call stealthy and secret, so far from betraying his own guilt, will actually make believe to be indignant at the knavery of another. That is what we mean by a cunning old hand. I remember assisting at a consultation, which Publius Sextilius Rufus held with his friends on the following matter. He had been left heir to Quintus Fadius Gallus. Fadius's will contained a statement that he had requested Sextilius to allow the whole of his estate to pass to his daughter. Sextilius now denied the arrangement, as he could do with impunity, for there was no one to rebut him. Not one of us believed his denial. It was more probable that he should be lying, as his pocket was concerned, than the testator, who had left it in writing that he had made a request which it had been his duty to make. Sextilius actually went on to say that, having sworn to maintain the Voconian law, he would not venture to break it unless his friends thought he ought to do so. I was only a young man, but many of the company were persons of high consideration, and every one of these advised him not to give Fadia more than she was entitled to get under the Voconian law. Sextilius kept a handsome property, not a penny of which he would have touched had he followed the advice of those who placed honour and right above all considerations of profit and advantage. Do you therefore suppose that he was afterwards troubled by remorse? Not a bit of it. On the contrary, the inheritance made him a rich man, and he was thoroughly pleased with himself in consequence. He thought he had scored heavily. He had won a fortune not only by no illegal means, but actually by the aid of the law. And, according to your school, it is right to try to get money even at some risk, for money procures many very delightful pleasures. Therefore, just as those who hold that things right and honourable are desirable for their own sake must often take risks in the cause of honour and morality, so Epicureans, who measure all things by pleasure, may properly take risks in order to obtain considerable pleasures. If a large sum of money or a great inheritance is at stake, inasmuch as money procures a great many pleasures, your Epicurus, if he wishes to attain his own end of goods, will have to act as Scipio did, when he had the chance of winning great renown by enticing Hannibal back to Africa. To do so he risked enormous dangers, for honour and pleasure was the aim of that great enterprise. Similarly, your Epicurean wise man, when stirred by the prospect of some considerable gain, will fight to the death, if need be, and with good reason. Do circumstances allow his crime to go undetected, so much the better. But, if found out, he will make light of every penalty, for he will have been schooled to make light of death, of exile, even of pain itself. The latter, indeed, you make out to be unendurable when you are enacting penalties for the wicked, but easy to bear when you are maintaining that the wise man will always command a preponderance of good. But suppose that our evildoer is not only clever, but also supremely powerful, as was Marcus Crassus, who, however, used actually to be guided by his natural goodness, or like our friend Pompeius at the present time, who deserves our gratitude for his upright conduct, since he might be as unjust as he liked with impunity. But how many unrighteous acts are possible which no one would be in a position to censure? If a friend of yours requests you on his deathbed to hand over his estate to his daughter without leaving his intention anywhere in writing, as Fadius did, or speaking of it to anybody, what will you do? You no doubt will hand over the money. Perhaps Epicurus himself would have done the same, as did Sextus Paducaeus, son of Sextus, a scholar and a gentleman of scrupulous honour, who left behind him a son, now a friend of today, to recall his father's culture and integrity. No one knew that such a request had been made to Sextus by a distinguished Roman knight named Gaius Plotius of Nursia, but Sextus of his own accord went to Plotius's widow, informed her, much to her surprise, of her husband's commission, and handed over the property to her. But the question I want to put to you is this. Since you yourself would undoubtedly have done the same, do you not see that the force of natural instinct is all the more firmly established by the fact that even you Epicureans, who profess to make your own interest and pleasure your sole standard, nevertheless perform actions that prove you to be really aiming not at pleasure, but at duty? Prove, I say, that the natural impulse towards right is more powerful than corrupt reason. Suppose, says Carneades, you should know that there is a viper lurking somewhere, and that someone, by whose death you stand to profit, is about to sit down on it unawares. Then you will do a wicked deed if you do not warn him not to sit down. But still your wickedness would go unpunished, for who could possibly prove that you knew? However, I labour the point unnecessarily. It is obvious that, if fair dealing, honesty, and justice have not their source in nature, and if all these things are only valuable for their utility, no good man can anywhere be found. The subject is fully discussed by Laelius in my volumes on the state. Apply the same test to temperance or moderation, which means the control of the appetites in obedience to the reason. Suppose a man yields to vicious impulses in secret. Is it no offence against purity? Or is it not true that an act can be sinful in itself, even though no disgrace attends it? And again, does a brave soldier go into battle and shed his blood for his country upon a nice calculation of the balance of pleasures, or in hot blood and under the stimulus of impulse? Come, Torquatus, if the great Imperiosus were listening to our debate, which of our two speeches about himself would he have heard with greater satisfaction, yours or mine? Me declaring that no deed of his was done for selfish ends, but all for motives of patriotism, or you maintaining that he acted solely for self? And suppose you wanted to make your meaning clearer, and had said more explicitly that all his actions were prompted by desire for pleasure, pray how do you imagine he would have taken it? But grant your view. Assume, if you like, that Torquatus acted for his own advantage. I would sooner put it in that way than say for his own pleasure, especially in the case of so great a man. Yet what about his colleague Publius Decius, the first of his family to be consul? When Decius vowed himself to death, and, setting spurs to his horse, was charging into the thickest of the Latin ranks, surely he had no thought of personal pleasure. Pleasure, where to be enjoyed, or when? For he knew he must die in a moment. Aye, and he courted death with more passionate ardour than Epicurus would have us seek pleasure. Had not his exploit won praise on its merits, it would not have been copied by his son in his fourth consulship, nor would the latter's son again, commanding a consul in the war with Pyrrhus, have also fallen in battle, third in succession of his line, to give himself a victim for the state. I refrain from further instances. The Greeks have but a modest list, Leonidas, Epaminondas, some 3 or 4. But were I to begin to cite the heroes of our race, I should doubtless succeed in making pleasure yield herself prisoner to virtue, but daylight would fall before I had done. Aulus Varius, noted for his severity as a judge, used to say to his colleague on the bench, when after witnesses had been produced still further witnesses were culled, "Either we have evidence enough already, or I do not know what evidence can be enough." Well, I have cited witnesses enough. Why, you yourself, in every way a worthy scion of your stock, was pleasure the inducement that led you, a mere youth, to wrest the consulship from Publius Sulla? You won that office for your gallant father, and what a consul he was, what a patriot, all his life long, and more, especially after his consulship. It was with his support that I carried through an affair which was for all men's interest, rather than my own. But how well you thought you put your case, when you pictured on the one hand a person loaded with an abundance of the most delightful pleasures, and free from all pain, whether present or in prospect, and on the other, one racked throughout his frame by the most excruciating pains, unqualified by any pleasure or hope of pleasure. then proceeded to ask who could be more wretched than the latter, or more happy than the former, and finally drew the conclusion that pain was the chief evil, and pleasure the chief good. Well, there was a certain Lucius Thorius of Lanuvium, whom you cannot remember. He lived on the principle of enjoying in the fullest measure all the most exquisite pleasures that could possibly be found. His appetite for pleasure was only equalled by his taste and ingenuity in devising them. He was so devoid of superstition as to scoff at all the sacrifices and shrines for which his native place is famous, and so free from fear of death that he died in battle for his country. Epicurus's classification of the desires meant nothing to him. He knew no limit by satiety. At the same time, he was careful of his health, took sufficient exercise to come hungry and thirsty to table, ate what was at once most appetizing and most digestible, drank enough wine for pleasure, and not too much for health, nor did he forego those other indulgences in the absence of which Epicurus declares that he cannot understand what good is. Pain he never experienced at all. Had it come to him, he would have borne it with fortitude, yet he would have called a doctor sooner than a philosopher. He had excellent health and a sound constitution. He was extremely popular. In short, his life was replete with pleasure of every variety. Your school pronounces him a happy man. At least your theory requires you to do so. But I place above him, I do not venture to say whom, virtue herself shall speak for me, and she will not hesitate to rank Marcus Regulus higher than this typically happy man, as you would call him. Regulus, of his own free will, and under no compulsion except that of a promise given to an enemy, returned from his native land to Carthage. Yet virtue proclaims that when he had done so, he was happier while tormented with sleeplessness and hunger than Thorius carousing on his couch of roses. Regulus had fought great wars, had twice been consul, had celebrated a triumph, yet all his earlier exploits he counted less great and glorious than the final disaster, which he chose to undergo for the sake of honour and of self-respect. A pitiable end, as it seems to us who hear of it, but full of pleasure for him who endured it. It is not merriment and wantonness, nor laughter or jesting, the comrade of frivolity, that make men happy. Those are happy, often in sadness, whose wills are strong and true. Lucretia, outraged by the royal prince, called on her fellow citizens to witness her wrong and died by her own hand. The indignation that this aroused in the Roman people, under the leadership and guidance of Brutus, won freedom for the state. And in gratitude to Lucretia's memory, both her husband and her father were made consuls for the first year of the Republic. 60 years after our liberties had been won, Lucius Verginius, a poor man of humble station, killed his maiden daughter with his own hand, rather than surrender her to the lust of Appius Claudius, who then held the highest power in the state. Either, Torquatus, you must reprobate such actions, or you must give up your championship of pleasure. But what defence can pleasure offer? What case can you make out for her, when she will be able to produce no famous men as her witnesses or supporters? On our side, we cite in evidence from our records and our annals men who spent their whole lives in glorious toils, men who would not have borne to hear pleasure so much as named. But in your discourses, history is dumb. In the school of Epicurus, I never heard one mention of Lycurgus, Solon, Miltiades, Themistocles, Epaminondas, who are always on the lips of the other philosophers. And now that we Romans too have begun to treat of these themes, what a marvellous roll of great men will our friend Atticus supply to us from his storehouses of learning. Would it not be better to talk of these than to devote those bulky volumes to Themista? Let us leave that sort of thing to the Greeks. True, we owe to them philosophy and all the liberal studies, yet there are topics not permitted to us that are allowable for them. Battle rages between the Stoics and the Peripatetics. One school declares that nothing is good but moral worth, The other that, while it assigns the greatest, and by far the greatest, value to morality, yet still some bodily and external things are good. Here is an honourable quarrel, fought out in high debate, for the whole dispute turns on the true worth of virtue. But when one argues with your friends, one has to listen to a great deal about even the grosser forms of pleasure. Epicurus is always harping upon them. Believe me then, Torquatus, if you will but look within, and study your own thoughts and inclinations, you cannot continue to defend the doctrines you profess. You will be put to the blush, I say, by the picture that Cleanthes used to draw so cleverly in his lectures. He would tell his audience to imagine a painting representing pleasure, decked as a queen and gorgeously apparelled, seated on a throne. At her side should stand the virtues as her handmaids, who should make it their sole object and duty to minister to pleasure, merely whispering in her ear the warning, provided this could be conveyed by the painter's art, to beware of unwittingly doing aught to offend public opinion, or anything from which pain might result. As for us virtues, we were born to be your slaves. That is our one and only business. But Epicurus, you will tell me, for this is your strong point, denies that anyone who does not live morally can live pleasantly. As if I cared what Epicurus says or denies. What I ask is, what is it consistent for a man to say who places the chief good in pleasure? What reason can you give me for thinking that Thorius, or Posthumus of Chios, or the master of them all, Orata, did not live extremely pleasant lives? Epicurus himself says that the life of sensualists is blameless, if they are not utter fools, for that is what his proviso, if they are free from fear and from desire, amounts to. And, as he offers an antidote for both desire and fear, he virtually offers free indulgence for sensuality. Eliminate those passions, he says, and he cannot find anything to blame in a life of profligacy. Consequently, you Epicureans, by taking pleasure as the sole guide, make it impossible for yourselves either to uphold or to retain virtue. For a man is not to be thought good and just who refrains from doing wrong to avoid incurring harm. No doubt you know the line, "None is good whose love of goodness." Believe me, nothing can be truer. As long as his motive is fear, he is not just, and assuredly as soon as he ceases to fear, he will not be just, and he will not feel fear if he can conceal his wrongdoing or is sufficiently powerful to brazen it out. And he will assuredly prefer the reputation without the reality of goodness to the reality without the reputation. So your school undoubtedly preaches the pretense of justice instead of the real and genuine thing. Its lesson amounts to this: we are to despise the trustworthy voice of our own conscience, and to run after the fallible imaginations of other men. The same applies in the case of the other virtues. Basing them entirely on pleasure, you are laying the foundations in water. Why, take the great Torquatus again. Can he really be called brave? For I delight, albeit my flattery, as you put it, is powerless to bribe you, I delight, I say, in your name and lineage. And indeed, I have personal recollections of that distinguished man, Aulus Torquatus, who was an affectionate friend of my own, and whose signal loyalty and devotion to me, in circumstances that are within universal knowledge, must be familiar to you both. Yet, for my part, anxious as I am to feel and show a proper gratitude, I would not have thanked him for his friendship had I not known that it was disinterested. Unless you choose to say that it was for his own interest, in this sense, that it is to every man's interest to act rightly. If you do say so, we have won our case. For our one principle, our one contention is, that duty is its own reward. This your great master does not allow. He expects everything to pay, to yield its quota of pleasure. But I return to old Torquatus. If it was to win pleasure that he accepted the Gallic warrior's challenge to single combat on the banks of the Anio, and if he despoiled him and assumed his necklet and the corresponding surname, for any other reason than that he thought such deeds became a man, I do not consider him brave. Again, if modesty, self-control, chastity, in a word, temperance, is to depend for its sanction on the fear of punishment or of disgrace, and not to maintain itself by its own intrinsic sacredness, what form of adultery, vice, or lust will not break loose and run riot when it is assured of concealment, impunity, or indulgence? Or what, pray, are we to think of the situation if you, Torquatus, bearing the name you do, and gifted and distinguished as you are, dare not profess before a public audience the real object of all your actions, aims, and endeavours, what it is, in short, that you consider the greatest good in life? In return for what payment or consideration, when not long hence you have attained to public office and come forward to address a meeting, for you will have to announce the rules that you propose to observe in administering justice, and very likely also, if you think good, you will follow the time-honoured custom of making some reference to your ancestors and to yourself. For what consideration, then, would you consent to declare that you intend, in office, to guide your conduct solely by pleasure, and that pleasure has been your aim in every action of your life? Do you take me for such an imbecile, you exclaim, as to talk in that fashion before ignorant people? Well, make the same profession in a law court, or, if you are afraid of the public there, say it in the Senate. You will never do it. Why, if not because such language is disgraceful? Then what a compliment to Torquatus and myself to use it in our presence. But let us grant your position. The actual word pleasure has not a lofty sound, and perhaps we do not understand its significance. You are always repeating that we do not understand what you mean by pleasure, as though it were a difficult or recondite notion. If we understand you when you talk of indivisible atoms and cosmic interspaces, things that don't exist and never can exist, is our intelligence incapable of grasping the meaning of pleasure, a feeling known to every sparrow? What if I force you to admit that I do know not only what pleasure really is, it is an agreeable activity of the sense, but also what you mean by it? For at one moment you mean by it the feeling that I have just defined, and this you entitle kinetic pleasure, as producing a definite change of feeling. But at another moment you say it is quite a different feeling, which is the acme and climax of pleasure, but yet consists merely in the complete absence of pain. This you call static pleasure. Well, grant that pleasure is the latter sort of feeling. Profess in any public assembly that the motive of all your actions is the desire to avoid pain. If you feel that this too does not sound sufficiently dignified and respectable, say that you intend, both in your present office and all your life long, to act solely for the sake of your own advantage, to do nothing but what will pay, nothing, in short, that is not for your own interest. Imagine the uproar among the audience. What would become of your chances of the consulship, which, as it is, seems to be a certainty for you in the near future? Will you then adopt a rule for life, which you can appeal to in private and among friends, but which you dare not openly profess or parade in public? Ah, but it is the vocabulary of the Peripatetics and the Stoics that is always on your lips in the law courts and the Senate. Duty, fair dealing, moral worth, fidelity, uprightness, honour, the dignity of office, the dignity of the Roman people, risk all for the state, die for your country. When you talk in this style, we simpletons stand gaping in admiration, and you no doubt laugh in your sleeve. For in that glorious array of high-sounding words, pleasure finds no place. Not only what your school calls kinetic pleasure, which is what everyone, polished or rustic, everyone, I say, who can speak Latin means by pleasure, but not even this static pleasure, which no one but you Epicureans would call pleasure at all. Well then, are you sure you have any right to employ our words with meanings of your own? If you assumed an unnatural expression or demeanour in order to look more important, that would be insincere. Are you then to affect an artificial language and say what you do not think? Or are you to change your opinions like your clothes, and have one set for indoor wear, and another when you walk abroad? Outside all show and pretence, but your genuine self concealed within. Reflect, I beg of you. Is this honest? In my view, those opinions are true which are honourable, praiseworthy, and noble, which can be openly avowed in the Senate and the popular assembly, and in every company and gathering, so that one need not be ashamed to say what one is not ashamed to think. Again, how will friendship be possible? How can one man be another man's friend if he does not love him in and for himself? What is the meaning of to love, from which our word friendship is derived, except to wish someone to receive the greatest possible benefits, even though one gleans no advantage therefrom oneself? It pays me, says he, to be a disinterested friend. No, perhaps it pays you to seem so. Be so you cannot, unless you really are. But how can you be a disinterested friend unless you feel genuine affection? Yet affection does not commonly result from any calculation of expediency. It is a spontaneous growth. It springs up of itself. But, you will say, I am guided by expediency. Then your friendship will last just so long as it is attended by expediency. If expediency creates the feeling, it will also destroy it. But what, pray, will you do if, as often happens, expediency parts company with friendship? Will you throw your friend over? What sort of friendship is that? Will you keep him? How does that square with your principles? You remember your pronouncement that friendship is desirable for the sake of expediency. I might become unpopular if I left a friend in the lurch. Well, in the first place, why is such conduct unpopular, unless because it is base? And if you refrain from deserting a friend because to do so you will have inconvenient consequences, still you will long for his death to release you from an unprofitable tie. What if he not only brings you no advantage, but causes you to suffer loss of property, to undergo toil and trouble, to risk your life? Will you not even then take interest into account, and reflect that each man is born for himself and for his own pleasure? Will you go bail with your life to a tyrant on behalf of a friend, as the famous Pythagorean did to the Sicilian despot? Or, being Pylades, will you say you are Orestes, so as to die in your friend's stead? Or, supposing you were Orestes, would you say that Pylades was lying and reveal your identity? And, if they would not believe you, would you make no appeal against your both dying together? Yes, Torquatus, you personally would do all these things, for I do not believe there is any high or noble action which fear of pain or death could induce you to forego. But the question is not what conduct is consistent with your character, but what is consistent with your tenets. The system you uphold, the principles you have studied and accept, undermine the very foundations of friendship, however much Epicurus may, as he does, praise friendship to the skies. But, you tell me, Epicurus himself had many friends. Who, pray, denies that Epicurus was a good man, and a kind and humane man? In these discussions it is his intellect and not his character that is in question. Let us leave to the frivolous Greeks the wrong-headed habit of attacking and abusing the persons whose views of truth they do not share. Epicurus may have been a kind and faithful friend, but if my opinion is right, for I do not dogmatize, he was not a very acute thinker. But he won many disciples. Yes, and perhaps he deserved to do so, but still the witness of the crowd does not carry much weight. For as in every art or study or science of any kind, so in right conduct itself, supreme excellence is extremely rare. And, to my mind, the fact that Epicurus himself was a good man, and that many Epicureans both have been and today are loyal to their friends, consistent and high-principled throughout their lives, ruling their conduct by duty and not by pleasure, all this does but enforce the value of moral goodness, and diminish that of pleasure. The fact is that some persons' lives and behaviour refute the principles they profess. Most men's words are thought to be better than their deeds. These people's deeds, on the contrary, seem to me better than their words. But this is, I admit, a digression. Let us return to what you said about friendship. In one of your remarks, I seem to recognize a saying of Epicurus himself, that friendship cannot be divorced from pleasure, and that it deserves to be cultivated for the reason that without it we cannot live secure and free from alarm, and therefore cannot live agreeably. Enough has been said in answer to this already. You quoted another and a more humane dictum of the more modern Epicureans, which, so far as I know, was never uttered by the master himself. This was to the effect that, although at the outset we desire a man's friendship for utilitarian reasons, yet when intimacy has grown up, we love our friend for his own sake, even if all prospect of pleasure be left out of sight. It is possible to take exception to this on several grounds. Still, I won't refuse what they give, as it is sufficient for my case and not sufficient for theirs. For it amounts to saying that moral action is occasionally possible, action prompted by no anticipation or desire of pleasure. You further alleged that other thinkers speak of wise men as making a sort of mutual compact to entertain the same sentiments towards their friends as they feel towards themselves. This, you said, was possible, and in fact had often occurred, and it was highly conducive to the attainment of pleasure. If men have succeeded in making this compact, let them make a further compact to love fair dealing, self-control, and all the virtues for their own sakes and without reward. If, on the other hand, we are to cultivate friendships for their results, for profit and utility, if there is to be no affection to render friendship in and for itself intrinsically and spontaneously desirable, can we doubt that we shall value land and house property more than friends? It is no good your once again repeating Epicurus's admirable remarks in praise of friendship. I am not asking what Epicurus actually says, but what he can say consistently while holding the theory he professes. Friendship is originally sought after from motives of utility. Well, but surely you don't reckon Triarius here a more valuable asset than the granaries at Puteoli would be if they belonged to you. Cite all the stock Epicurean maxims. Friends are a protection. You can protect yourself. The laws will protect you. Ordinary friendships offer protection enough. You will be too powerful to despise as it is, while hatred and envy it will be easy to avoid. Epicurus gives rules for doing so. And in any case, with so large an income to give away, you can dispense with the romantic sort of friendship that we have in mind. You will have plenty of well-wishers to defend you quite effectively. But a confidant to share your grave thoughts or gay, as the saying is, all your secrets and private affairs. Your best confidant is yourself. Also, you may confide in a friend of the average type. But granting that friendship has the conveniences you mention, what are they compared with the advantages of vast wealth? You see then that, although if you measure friendship by the test of its own charm, it is unsurpassed in value. By the standard of profit, the most affectionate intimacy is outweighed by the rents of a valuable estate. So you must love me yourself, not my possessions, if we are to be genuine friends. But we dwell too long upon the obvious, for when it has been conclusively proved that if pleasure is the sole standard, there is no room left either for virtue or for friendship, there is no great need to say anything further. Still, I do not want you to think I have failed to answer any of your points, so I will now say a few words in reply to the remainder of your discourse. The entire end and aim of philosophy is the attainment of happiness, and desire for happiness is the sole motive that has led men to engage in this study. But different thinkers make happiness consistent in different things. According to your school, it consists in pleasure, and, conversely, misery consists solely in pain. Let us then begin by examining what sort of thing happiness, as you conceive it, is. You will grant, I suppose, that if there is such a thing as happiness, it is bound to be attainable in its entirety by the wise man. For if happiness once won can be lost, a happy life is impossible. since who can feel confident of permanently and securely retaining a possession that is perishable and precarious? Yet one who is not sure of the permanence of his goods must inevitably fear, lest at some time he may lose them and be miserable. But no one can be happy who is uneasy about matters of the highest moment. Therefore, no one can be happy at all. For we usually speak of life as a happy one, not in reference to a part of it, but to the whole of a lifetime. Indeed, a life means a finished and complete life. Nor is it possible to be at one time happy and at another miserable, since he who thinks he may be miserable will not be happy. For when happiness has once been achieved, it is as permanent as wisdom itself, which is the efficient cause of happiness. It does not wait for the end of our mortal term, as Croesus in Herodotus's history was warned by Solon to do. It may be rejoined that Epicurus, as you yourself were saying, maintains that long duration cannot add anything to happiness, and that as much pleasure is enjoyed in a brief span of time as if pleasure were everlasting. In this he is grossly inconsistent. He places the chief good in pleasure, and yet he says that no greater pleasure would result from a lifetime of endless duration than from a limited and moderate period. If a person finds the sole good in virtue, it is open to him to say that the happy life is consummated by the consummation of virtue, for his position is that the chief good is not increased by lapse of time. But if one thinks that happiness is produced by pleasure, how can he consistently deny that pleasure is increased by duration? If it is not, pain is not either. Or if pain is worse the longer it lasts, is not pleasure rendered more desirable by continuance? On what grounds then does Epicurus speak of the deity, for so he always does, as happy and everlasting? Take away his everlasting life, and Jove is no happier than Epicurus. Each of them enjoys the chief good, that is to say, pleasure. Ah, but, you say, Epicurus is liable to pain as well. Yes, but he thinks nothing of pain, for he tells us that if he were being burnt to death, he would exclaim, "How delightful this is!" Wherein then is he inferior to God, except that God lives forever? But what good has everlasting life to offer beside supreme and never-ending pleasure? What then is the use of your high-flown language if it be not consistent? Bodily pleasure, and I will add, if you like, mental pleasure, so long as this, as you hold, is understood to have its source in the body, constitutes happiness. Well, who can guarantee this pleasure for the wise man in perpetuity? For the things that produce pleasure are not in the wise man's control, since happiness does not consist in wisdom itself, but in the means to pleasure which wisdom can procure. But all the apparatus of pleasure is external, and what is external must depend on chance. Consequently, happiness becomes the slave of fortune. Yet Epicurus says that fortune interferes with the wise man but little. Come, you will say, these are trivial objections. The wise man is endowed with nature's own riches, and these, as Epicurus has shown, are easy of attainment. This is excellently said, and I do not combat it, but Epicurus's own statements are at war with each other. He tells us that the simplest fare, that is, the meanest sorts of food and drink, afford no less pleasure than a banquet of the rarest delicacies. For my part, if he said that it made no difference to happiness what sort of food he ate, I should agree, and what is more, I should applaud, for he would be telling the truth. I will listen to Socrates, who holds pleasure of no account, when he says that the best sauce for food is hunger, and the best flavouring for drink, thirst. But I will not listen to one who makes pleasure the sole standard, when, while living like Galonius, he talks like Piso the Thrifty. I refuse to believe in his sincerity. He said that natural wealth is easily won, because nature is satisfied with little. Undoubtedly, if only you Epicureans did not value pleasure so highly. As much pleasure, he says, is derived from the cheapest things as from the most costly. Dear me, His palate must be as dull as his wits. Persons who despise pleasure in itself are at liberty to say that they value a sturgeon no higher than a sprat. But a man whose chief good consists in pleasure is bound to judge everything by sensation, not by reason, and to call those things the best which are the pleasantest. However, let us grant his point. Let him get the highest pleasures cheap, or for all I care for nothing, if he can. Allow that there is as much pleasure to be found in the cress salad, which, according to Xenophon, formed the staple diet of the Persians, as in the Syracusan banquets, which Plato takes to task so severely. Grant, I say, that pleasure is as easy to get as your school makes out. But what are we to say of pain? Pain can inflict such tortures as to render happiness absolutely impossible. That is, if it be true that pain is the chief evil. Metrodorus himself, who was almost a second Epicurus, describes happiness, I give almost his actual words, as sound health and an assurance of its continuance. Can anyone have an assurance of what his health will be, I don't say a year hence, but this evening? It follows that we can never be free from the apprehension of pain, which is the chief evil, even when it is absent, for at any moment it may be upon us. How then can life be happy when haunted by the fear of the greatest evil? Ah, but, he rejoins, Epicurus teaches a method for disregarding pain. To begin with, the mere idea of disregarding that which is the greatest of evils is absurd. But what is this method, pray? The severest pain, says he, is brief. First of all, what do you mean by brief? And secondly, what do you mean by the severest pain? Why, cannot the most intense pain last for several days? You may find it last for months. Unless indeed you mean a seizure that instantly kills you. But no one is afraid of such a pain as that. I want you rather to alleviate such agony as I have seen afflicting my excellent and amiable friend Gnaeus Octavius, son of Marcus, and that not once only, or for a short time, but repeatedly and for very long periods. Great heavens, what torments he used to suffer! All his joints felt as if on fire. And yet one did not think of him as miserable, because such pain was not the greatest evil, only as afflicted. Miserable he would have been if he had lived a life of profligacy and vice, surrounded by every pleasure. As for your maxim that severe pain is short, and prolonged pain light, I cannot make out what it may mean. For I see pains that are at once severe and considerably prolonged, and the truer way to endure them is the other method, which you who do not love moral worth for its own sake are not able to employ. Courage has its precepts and its rules, rules of constraining force, that forbid a man to show womanish weakness in pain. Hence it must be considered a disgrace, I do not say to feel pain, that is sometimes inevitable, but that, rock of Lemnos to outrage, with the cries of a Philoctetes, till the dumb stones utter a voice of weeping, echoing his wails and plaints, his sighs and groanings. Let Epicurus soothe with his spells, if he can, the man whose veins and vitals, from the viper's fang envenomed, throb with pangs of anguish dire, in this way: Philoctetes, if pain is severe, it is short. Oh, but he has been languishing in his cave for these 10 years past. If it is long, it is light, for it grants intervals of respite. In the first place, this is not often the case, and, secondly, what is the good of a respite embittered by recent pain still fresh in memory, and tormented by fear of pain impending in the future? Let him die, says Epicurus. Perhaps that were the best course, but what becomes of the maxim about a constant preponderance of pleasure? If that be true, are you not guilty of a crime in advising him to end his life? Well then, let us rather tell him that it is base and unmanly to let pain demoralize, crush, and conquer one. As for the formula of your sect, short if it's strong, light if it's long, it is a tag for copybooks. virtue, magnanimity, endurance, courage. It is these that have balm to assuage pain. But I must not digress too far. Let me repeat the dying words of Epicurus to prove to you the discrepancy between his practice and his principles. Epicurus to Hermachus, greeting. I write these words, he says, on the happiest and the last day of my life. I am suffering from diseases of the bladder and intestines, which are of the utmost possible severity. Unhappy creature! If pain is the chief evil, that is the only thing to be said. But let us hear his own words. Yet all my sufferings, he continues, are counterbalanced by the joy which I derive from remembering my theories and discoveries. I charge you, by the devotion which from your youth you have displayed towards myself and towards philosophy, to protect the children of Metrodorus. When I read this, I rank the death scene of Epicurus on a level with those of Epaminondas and Leonidas. Epaminondas had defeated the Lacedaemonians at Mantinea, and perceived himself to be mortally wounded. As soon as he opened his eyes, he inquired if his shield were safe. His weeping followers told him that it was. He asked, were the enemy routed? Satisfied on this point, he bade them pluck out the spear that pierced his side. A rush of blood followed, and so, in the hour of joy and victory, he died. Leonidas, king of the Lacedaemonians, had to choose between dishonourable flight and a glorious death. With the 300 warriors that he had brought from Sparta, he confronted the foe at Thermopylae. A great commander's death is famous, but philosophers mostly die in their beds. Still, it makes a difference how they die. Epicurus counts himself happy in his last moments. All honour to him. My joy, he writes, counterbalances the severest pain. The words of a philosopher, Epicurus, command my attention, but you forget what you logically ought to say. In the first place, if the things in the recollection of which you profess to find pleasure, I mean your writings and discoveries, are true, you cannot really be feeling pleasure. All feelings referable to the body are over for you. Yet you have always maintained that no one feels either pleasure or pain except on account of the body. He says, I take pleasure in my past feelings. What past feelings? If you mean bodily feelings, I notice that it is not the memory of bodily delights, but your philosophical theories that counterbalance for you your present pains. If mental feelings, your doctrine that there is no delight of the mind not ultimately referable to the body is an error. And secondly, why do you provide for the children of Metrodorus? What standard of bodily pleasure are you following in this signal act, for so I esteem it, of loyalty and duty? Yes, Torquatus, you people may turn and twist as you like, but you will not find a line in this famous letter of Epicurus that is not inconsistent and incompatible with his teachings. Hence he is his own refutation. His writings are disproved by the uprightness of his character. That provision for the care of the children, that loyalty to friendship and affection, that observance of these solemn duties with his latest breath, prove that there was innate in the man a disinterested uprightness, not evoked by pleasure, nor elicited by prizes and rewards. Seeing so strong a sense of duty in a dying man, what clearer evidence do we want that morality and rectitude are desirable for their own sakes? But, while I think that the letter I have just translated, almost word for word, is most admirable, although entirely inconsistent with the chief tenets of his philosophy, yet I consider his will to be quite out of harmony, not only with the dignity of a philosopher, but also with his own pronouncement. For he repeatedly argued at length, and also stated briefly and plainly in the book I have just mentioned, that death does not affect us at all, for a thing that has experienced dissolution must be devoid of sensation, and that which is devoid of sensation cannot affect us in any degree whatsoever. The maxim, such as it is, might have been better and more neatly put, for the phrase, "What has experienced dissolution must be devoid of sensation," does not make clear what it is that has experienced dissolution. However, in spite of this, I understand the meaning intended. What I want to know is this. If all sensation is annihilated by dissolution, that is, by death, and if nothing whatever that can affect us remains, why is it that he makes such precise and careful provision and stipulation that his heirs, Amminomachus and Timocratus, shall, after consultation with Hermachus, assign a sufficient sum to celebrate his birthday every year in the month of Gamalion, and also on the 20th day of every month shall assign a sum for a banquet to his fellow students in philosophy, in order to keep alive the memory of himself and of Metrodorus? That these are the words of as amiable and kindly a man as you like, I cannot deny. But what business has a philosopher, and especially a natural philosopher, which Epicurus claims to be, to think that any day can be anybody's birthday? Why, can the identical day that has once occurred recur again and again? Assuredly it is impossible. Or can a similar day recur? This too is impossible, except after an interval of many thousands of years, when all the heavenly bodies simultaneously achieve their return to the point from which they started. It follows that there is no such thing as anybody's birthday. But a certain day is so regarded. Much obliged, I am sure, for the information. But even granting birthdays, is a person's birthday to be observed when he is dead? And, to provide for this by will, is this appropriate for a man who told us in oracular tones that nothing can affect us after death? Such a provision ill became one whose intellect had roamed over unnumbered worlds and realms of infinite space, without shores or circumference. Did Democritus do anything of the kind? To omit others, I cite the case of the philosopher who was Epicurus's only master. And if a special day was to be kept, did he do well to take the day on which he was born, and not rather that on which he became a wise man? You will object that he could not have become a wise man if he had not first of all been born. You might as well equally say if his grandmother had not been born either. The entire notion of wishing one's name and memory to be celebrated by a banquet after one's death is alien to a man of learning. I won't refer to your mode of keeping these anniversaries, or the shafts of wit you bring upon you from persons with a sense of humour. We do not want to quarrel. I only remark that it was more your business to keep Epicurus's birthday than his business to provide by will for its celebration. But to return to our subject, for we were discussing the question of pain when we digressed to the letter of Epicurus, the whole matter may now be put in the following syllogism. A man undergoing the supreme evil is not for the time being happy, but the wise man is always happy, and sometimes undergoes pain. Therefore, pain is not the supreme evil. And again, what is the sense of the maxim that the wise man will not let past blessings fade from memory, and that it is a duty to forget past misfortunes? To begin with, have we the power to choose what we shall remember? Themistocles, at all events, when Simonides or someone offered to teach him the art of memory, replied that he would prefer the art of forgetting. For I remember, said he, even things I don't wish to remember, but I cannot forget things I wish to forget. Epicurus was a very able man, but still the fact of the matter is that a philosopher who forbids us to remember lays too heavy a charge upon us. Why, you are as great a martinet as your ancestor Manlius, or greater, if you order me to do what is beyond my power. What if the memory of past evils be actually pleasant, proving certain proverbs truer than the tenets of your school? There is a popular saying to the effect that toil is pleasant when 'tis over, and Euripides well writes, I will attempt a verse translation, the Greek line is known to you all, sweet is the memory of sorrows past. But let us return to the question of past blessings. If your school meant by these the sort of successes that Gaius Marius could fall back on, enabling him, when a penniless exile up to his chin in a swamp, to lighten his sufferings by recollecting his former victories, I would listen to you, and would unreservedly assent. Indeed, it would be impossible for the happiness of the wise man to attain its final and ultimate perfection, if all his wise designs and good deeds were to be successively erased from his memory. But with you it is the recollection of pleasures enjoyed that gives happiness, and those must be bodily pleasures, for if it be any others, it ceases to be true that mental pleasures all arise from the connection of the mind with the body. Yet if bodily pleasures, even when past, can give delight, I do not see why Aristotle should be so contemptuous of the epitaph of Sardanapalus. The famous Syrian monarch boasts that he has taken with him all the sensual pleasures that he has enjoyed. How, asks Aristotle, could a dead man continue to experience a feeling which, even while alive, he could only be conscious of so long as he was actually enjoying it? So the bodily pleasures are transient. Each in turn evaporates, leaving cause for regrets more often than for recollection. Accordingly, Africanus must be counted happier than Sardanapalus when he addresses his country with the words, "Cease, Rome, thy foes," and the glorious conclusion, "My toils have won thee battlements secure." His past toils are what he delights in, whereas you bid us dwell on our past pleasures. He recalls experiences that never had any connection with bodily enjoyment, but you never rise above the body. Again, how can you possibly defend the dictum of your school that all mental pleasures and pains alike are based on pleasures and pains of the body? Do you, Torquatus, for I bethink me who it is I am addressing, do you personally never experience in something for its own sake? I pass over moral worth and goodness, and the intrinsic beauty of the virtues of which we spoke before. I will suggest less serious matters, reading or writing a poem or a speech, the study of history or geography, statues, pictures, scenery, the games and wild beast shows, Lucullus's country house. I won't mention your own, for that would give you a loophole of escape. You would say it is a source of bodily enjoyment. But take the things I have mentioned. Do you connect them with bodily sense? Is there nothing which of itself affords you delight? Persist in tracing back the pleasures I have instanced to the body, and you show yourself impervious to argument. Recant, and you abandon Epicurus's conception of pleasure altogether. As for your contention that mental pleasures and pains are greater than bodily, because the mind apprehends all three periods of time, whereas the body perceives only present sensations, surely it is absurd to say that a man who rejoices in sympathy with my pleasure feels more joy than I feel myself. Pleasure of the mind arises out of sympathy with that of the body, and pleasure of the mind is greater than that of the body. Thus it comes about that one who offers congratulations feels more delight than the person congratulated. But when you try to prove the wise man happy on the ground that he enjoys the greatest mental pleasures, and that these are infinitely greater than bodily pleasures, you do not see the difficulty that meets you. For it follows that the mental pains which he experiences will also be infinitely greater than the bodily ones. Hence, he whom you maintain to be always happy would inevitably be sometimes miserable. Nor in fact will you ever prove him to be invariably happy, as long as you make pleasure and pain the sole standard. Therefore we are bound, Torquatus, to find some other chief good for man. Let us leave pleasure to the lower animals, to whose evidence on this question of the chief good your school is fond of appealing. But what if even animals are prompted by their several natures to do some actions conclusively proving that they have some other than pleasure? Some of them show kindness even at the cost of trouble, as for instance in giving birth to and rearing their offspring. Some delight in running and roaming about. Others are gregarious and create something resembling a social polity. In a certain class of birds we see some traces of affection, and also recognition and recollection, and in many we even notice regret for a lost friend. If animals therefore possess some semblance of the human virtues unconnected with pleasure, are men themselves to display no virtue except as a means to pleasure? And shall we say that man, who so far surpasses all other living creatures, has been gifted by nature with no exceptional endowment? As a matter of fact, if pleasure be all in all, the lower animals are far and away superior to ourselves. The earth of herself, without labour of theirs, lavishes on them food from her stores in great variety and abundance, whereas we, with the most laborious efforts, can scarcely, if at all, supply our needs. Yet I cannot think that the chief good can possibly be the same for a brute beast and for a man. What is the use of all our vast machinery of culture, of the great company of liberal studies, of the goodly fellowship of the virtues, if all these things are sought after solely for the sake of pleasure? Suppose when Xerxes led forth his huge fleets and armies of horse and foot, bridged the Hellespont, cut through Athos, marched over sea and sailed over land, suppose on his reaching Greece with his great armada, someone asked him the reason for all this enormous apparatus of warfare, and he were to reply that he wanted to procure some honey from Hymettus. Surely he would be thought to have had no adequate motive for so vast an undertaking. So with our wise man, equipped and adorned with all the noblest accomplishments and virtues, not like Xerxes traversing the seas on foot and the mountains on shipboard, but mentally embracing sky and earth and sea in their entirety. To say that this man's aim is pleasure is to say that all his high endeavour is for the sake of a little honey. No, Torquatus, believe me, we are born for loftier and more splendid purposes. Nor is this evidenced by the mental faculties alone, including, as they do, a memory for countless facts, in your case indeed, a memory of unlimited range, a power of forecasting the future little short of divination, the sense of modesty to curb the appetites, love of justice, the faithful guardian of human society, contempt of pain and death, remaining firm and steadfast when toil is to be endured and danger undergone. These are our mental endowments, but I would also have you consider our actual members and our organs of sensation, which, like the other parts of the body, you for your part will esteem not as the comrades merely, but actually as the servants of the virtues. But if even the body has many attributes of higher value than pleasure, such as strength, health, beauty, speed of foot, what, pray, think you of the mind? The wisest philosophers of old believed that the mind contains an element of the celestial and divine, whereas if the chief good consisted in pleasure, as your school avers, the ideal of happiness would be to pass days and nights in the enjoyment of the keenest pleasure, without a moment's intermission, every sense drenched and stimulated with every sort of delight. But who that is worthy to be called a human being would choose to pass a single entire day in pleasure of that description? The Cyrenaics, it is true, do not repudiate it. On this point your friends are more decent, but the Cyrenaics perhaps more consistent. But let us pass in review not these arts of first importance, a lack of which with our ancestors gave a man the name of inert or good for nothing, but I ask you whether you believe that, I do not say Homer, Archilochus, or Pindar, but Phidias, Polyclitus, and Zeuxis, regarded the purpose of their art as pleasure. Then shall a craftsman have a higher ideal of external than a distinguished citizen of moral beauty. What else is the cause of an error so profound and so very widely diffused than the fact that he who decides that pleasure is the chief good judges the question not with the rational and deliberate part of his mind, but with its lowest part, the faculty of desire? For I ask you, if gods exist, as your school too believes, how can they be happy, seeing that they cannot enjoy bodily pleasures? Or if they are happy without that kind of pleasure, why do you deny that the wise man is capable of a like purely mental activity? Read the panegyrics, Torquatus, not of the heroes praised by Homer, not of Cyrus or Agesilaus, Aristides or Themistocles, Philip or Alexander, but read those delivered upon our own great men. Read those of your own family. You will not find anyone extolled for his skill and cunning in procuring pleasures. This is not what is conveyed by epitaphs, like that one near the city gate. Here lieth one whom many lands agree, Rome's first and greatest citizen to be. Do we suppose that many lands agreed that Catilinus was Rome's greatest citizen because of his surpassing eminence in the acquisition of pleasures? Then are we to say that a youth is a young man of great promise and high character, when we judge him likely to study his own interests and do whatever will be for his own personal advantage? Do we not see what a universal upheaval and confusion would result from such a principle? It does away with generosity and with gratitude, the bonds of mutual harmony. If you lend a man money for your own advantage, this cannot be considered an act of generosity, it is usury. No gratitude is owing to a man who lends money for gain. In fact, if pleasure usurps the sovereignty, all the cardinal virtues must inevitably be dethroned. And also, there are a number of base qualities which can, with difficulty, be proved inconsistent with the character of the wise man, unless it be a law of nature that moral goodness should be supreme. Not to bring forward further arguments, for they are countless in number, any sound commendation of virtue must needs keep pleasure at arm's length. Do not expect me further to argue the point. Look within. Study your own consciousness. Then, after full and careful introspection, ask yourself the question: would you prefer to pass the whole of your life in that state of calm which you spoke of so often, amidst the enjoyment of unceasing pleasures, free from all pain, and even, an addition which your school is fond of postulating, but which is really impossible, free from all fear of pain, or to be a benefactor of the entire human race, and to bring succour and safety to the distressed, even at the cost of enduring the dolours of a Hercules? Dolours, that was indeed the sad and gloomy name which our ancestors bestowed, even in the case of a god, upon labours which were not to be evaded. I would press my question and drag an answer from you, were I not afraid lest you should say that Hercules himself, in the arduous labours that he wrought for the preservation of mankind, was acting for the sake of pleasure. Here I concluded. I am at no loss for authorities, said Torquatus, to whom to refer your arguments. I might be able to do some execution myself, but I prefer to find better equipped champions. No doubt you allude to our excellent and learned friends Cicero and Philodemus. You are right, he replied. Very well then, said I, but it would be fairer to let Triarius pronounce some verdict on our dispute. I formally object to him as prejudiced, he rejoined with a smile, at all events on this issue. You have shown us some mercy, but Triarius lays about him like a true Stoic. Oh, interposed Triarius, I'll fight more boldly still next time, for I shall have the arguments I have just heard ready to hand, though I won't attack you till I see you have been armed by the instructors whom you mention. And with these words we brought our promenade and our discussion to an end together. End of Book 2.